Chapter 47. While Li Yi was looking around, the people around him were also looking at him. The person who made candied haws and improved the princess's depression was the scholar in front of them. It had to be said that this was quite different from the image they had imagined. It's not difficult to make candied haws. You just need to add water to the icing and boil it into a sugar paste, and then wrap it on the red fruits without seeds. Li Yi looked at the young man and said, "I've told you the method of making candied haws. I'm sorry, I still have something urgent to deal with. Goodbye." Li Yi didn't want to tell anyone about the core technique of candied haws. He was not familiar with this guy, and he just wanted to keep his own territory. He didn't want to have anything to do with the prince's mansion. If he didn't go back, Fong would be worried if he couldn't find him. After that, Li Yi strode outside. "Child, please wait." At this moment, a sweet voice came from behind. The girl named Yanji quickly walked up and said, "Child, you don't know. Although there are only two materials, red fruits and icing, we have tried many times, but the taste of the candied haws is still not satisfactory. Please tell me if there is any mystery in it." Li Yi paused and then said with a smile, "Miss, I'm afraid you think too much. I've told you everything I know. There is no mystery in it." Li Yi's face was full of sincerity. Although the girl still had doubts in her heart, she was already 70 to 80% convinced. She turned to the young man and said, "Young prince, the person who sold the candied haws yesterday was not this young master. I'm afraid we have the wrong person." "Yes, yes." Li Yi nodded and quickened his pace toward the door. 10 taels of silver. At this moment, the young man suddenly said. The girl was stunned when she heard this. She didn't know what the little prince meant. At the same time, Li Yi had just stepped out of the door when he suddenly stopped. "I was rude just now. If I offended you in any way, please don't blame me. Yanji, give this brother 10 taels of silver as an apology." Li Yi turned his head and found that the young man was looking at him with a faint smile. After looking at the young man for a few seconds, Li Yi also smiled. Only the two of them knew what this smile meant. This little prince was also a person who was particular. The smile on Li Yi's face became even brighter. He said with a smile, "Although there is nothing special about the cooking method of this dish, it is rare for the young prince to be so kind. What's the harm in trying it out?" Although she didn't know why this child suddenly changed his mind, he had promised to help her. The girl was happy and said hurriedly, "Thank you very much." The strange expression on the young man's face became even more obvious. He stretched out his hand and made an inviting gesture. "Brother, please." After a while, everyone, including the young man, looked at Li Yi skillfully handling the hawthorn and boiling the sugar paste. His movements were smooth, and their faces revealed an astonished expression. For a gentle and refined scholar to do such things, it still gave them quite a shock. Because there were no bamboo sticks, Li Yi wrapped the candied hawthorn in the sugar paste and placed it on a plate. The girl used her chopsticks to pick one up. After taking a bite, her beautiful eyes couldn't help but light up. She turned to the young man and said, "Little prince, this is the taste from yesterday. I'll send it to mother right away." The young man was overjoyed. He took the plate from the girl's hands and strode out. Li Yi felt a little strange when he heard this. From the looks of it, the one who liked eating candied hawthorn seemed to be some princess. Could it be that eating candied hawthorn could make one addicted? After the young man left, the girl bowed to Li Yi and said, "Thank you, young master. Thanks to young master's candied hawthorn, the princess's illness has improved." The princess's illness. Li Yi was a little confused when he heard this. He really didn't know that candied hawthorn could actually have the effect of treating illnesses. "May I ask, what illness is the princess suffering from?" Li Yi was a little curious and couldn't help but ask. The girl's expression was a little hesitant, but then she thought about it. If it wasn't for the scholar in front of her, the princess's illness wouldn't have improved. After thinking for a while, she said, "The imperial physician said it's an illness of stagnation. However, after taking the medicine for half a month, the princess is still tired of eating every day and can't sleep at night. During this period of time, her body has become increasingly thin." Li Yi didn't know what an illness of stagnation was, but he understood from the girl's description. Can't eat, can't sleep, is prone to fever, and is getting more and more haggard. Isn't this indigestion? Needless to say, Li Yi also knew that in this prince's mansion, there must be a lot of fish and meat all day long. If one's stomach wasn't good, it would be strange if he didn't have indigestion. And candied hawthorn had the effect of clearing the lungs, digesting food, and stimulating the appetite. It was especially effective for indigestion caused by eating too much meat. In his previous life, Li Yi's stomach was very bad. Every time he came home, one of the dishes on the table was candied hawthorn. When he was studying abroad, his mother would often call to remind him to take care of his stomach, eat less greasy food, eat more coarse grains, pay attention to nourishing his stomach, and don't stay up late at night. And that person who loved him the most and treated him the best in the world, he would never see her again. Suddenly touching the deepest memories in his heart, Li Yi's eyes unconsciously became wet. The girl named Yanji looked at the scholar with tears in his eyes in surprise. She just talked about the princess's illness, and this child was moved to tears. At this moment, the door of the kitchen was suddenly pushed open, and the young prince walked in with an excited face. He ordered a few cooks, immediately make some of the princess's favorite dishes. "I didn't expect this candied hawthorn to have such a miraculous effect." The young man turned to look at Li Yi and said with a face full of surprise. The illness of stagnation that even the imperial physicians couldn't do anything about could actually improve because of this small thing. His mother, who was usually extremely anorexic, actually took the initiative to eat after eating those red fruits. It was really hard to imagine. At this moment, Li Yi's mood had already returned to normal. He smiled and said, "The red fruits are indeed effective in treating stagnation, but it isn't a cure for the root cause. Do you know how to treat stagnation?" The young man's body suddenly trembled when he heard this, and he grabbed Li Yi's arm and asked. "I know a thing or two," Li Yi said with a smile. Li Yi felt a little apologetic in his heart for charging him 10 taels of silver for a candied hawthorn dish. No matter what, they were old customers. Li Yi had to make them feel that these 10 taels of silver were well spent. If these words were said by someone else, the young man and the girl would definitely not believe them. But when Li Yi said it, they already believed most of it. After all, he had already created a miracle. Just as the expressions on the two's faces became wild with joy, on the other side of Qing and Prefectural City, looking at the gradually darkening sky, Master Fang's face was full of anxiety and worry. Chapter 48. Fang searched the entire Qing and prefecture but did not find any trace of Li Yi. "Fang Lao-san, you fool. Isn't the son-in-law with you? You've lost him." Another man beside Fang looked equally anxious. "I don't know. I just went to the bathroom and when I came back, the son-in-law was gone," Fang said helplessly. Even he couldn't understand. How could such a grown man like the son-in-law go missing just like that? "If the son-in-law really can't be found, I'll see how you're going to explain it to Miss." The man beside him glared at him and said, "Do you think the son-in-law ran away?" At this moment, a hint of hesitation appeared on the other man's face and he spoke hesitantly. "Nonsense." Hearing this, the man surnamed Fang was like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. He turned his head abruptly and looked at him with an unfriendly gaze. He reprimanded, "The son-in-law is not that kind of person." "Fang." The man who reprimanded the man surnamed Fang spoke in a low voice and said slowly, "What old Wu said is not impossible. After all, the son-in-law He did not finish his sentence, but everyone understood what he meant. After all, the son-in-law was snatched. Although during this period of time, almost everyone had deliberately ignored this fact, it was still an undeniable fact. Because of the appearance of Li Yi, their lives had long been turned upside down. No one was willing to mention that matter. From the bottom of their hearts, they had already regarded Li Yi as one of their own. However, no matter how unwilling they were to admit it, at this moment, everyone could not help but think of a certain worse possibility. Everyone, let's split up and search again. Where could the son-in-law be waiting for us? After a moment, a resolute expression appeared on the face of the man surnamed Fang. He gritted his teeth and said in a low voice. The rest of them looked at each other and could only sigh. They dispersed and began another round of searching. Li Yi was not a medical student. If the princess had any other illness, he, who had not digested a medical book, naturally had no right to speak. But when it came to treating gastrointestinal problems and indigestion, he could be considered half an expert. In his previous life, in order to adjust his stomach, his mother had used all kinds of methods. At that time, Li Yi did not care much about it. Now that he thought about it, each and every one of them was clearly imprinted in his mind, as if they were carved into his memory. Li Yi did not give them a long lecture on modern medical theories and directly said, other than using red fruits and sugar to stir-fry candied haws, you can crush corn and yam together and boil it into porridge. It will also have a miraculous effect on treating Wang Fei's illness. Stir-fried hawthorn with sugar and yam porridge were common dishes on Li Yi's dining table. There was no digestive aid in this world. Hawthorn could only be used as an appetizer. When the appetite was good, the body would naturally be better. The pretty servant girl and the young prince listened attentively. Li Yi continued, every day after dinner, Wang Fei can take a walk in the garden for an hour. It will also help to alleviate the illness. In addition, there is one more thing to remember. For this period of time, Wang Fei's diet should be light. You must not eat meat or fish all day. Try to avoid greasy food, such as, at this point in Li Yi's speech, the young man hurriedly ordered the few cooks, did you all hear that? Remove all the greasy dishes I mentioned. That's about all I know. After speaking for so long, Li Yi could not help but feel a little thirsty. His eyes inadvertently glanced out of the window and found that the sky had completely darkened. Yanji, do you remember everything I said? The young man turned to the young girl and asked. Hearing this, Yanji nodded, young prince, I have remembered everything. Even the imperial physicians were helpless. This handsome scholar in front of them was their only hope. If Li Yi was giving them a prescription, they would definitely carefully consider it. But he did not mention anything from the beginning to the end. Most of it was a change in the diet. Although they did not understand the reason, it seemed that he did not speak without thinking, it is getting late. I have told you everything I know. I will not disturb you anymore. With the 10 taels of silver already in his pocket, Li Yi very timely said his goodbyes. If he was any later, Fang and the others would be anxious to death. The young man did not know whether Li Yi's method was effective or not. But the appearance of the candied hawthorn had indeed improved his mother's condition. For this, he had to owe Li Yi a favor. Putting an arm around Li Yi's shoulder, he said, Brother, you have helped me so much. If I do not thank you properly, I will feel very sorry. How about this, we will hold a banquet in the Jade Courtyard tonight. We will not stop until we are drunk. During this period of time, his mother's illness had almost become a sore point in his heart. Now that he had seen endless hope, he was extremely carefree. There is no need for a banquet. I have urgent matters to attend to at home. Hey, brother, this is not right. Are you looking down on me? I do not mean that, then follow me. The young girl named Yanji watched the young prince and the scholar leave with their arms around each other's shoulders. Her pretty face could not help but show a trace of a smile. This young prince of her family was good at everything except for the fact that he did not have any arrogance. He looked like a playboy. If he were to inherit the throne in the future, the young girl really could not imagine what kind of situation it would be. This thought only appeared in her mind for a moment, and she hurriedly left the kitchen. Although she remembered everything that the scholar had said just now, it was hard to guarantee that she would not forget it in the future. It was better to find a piece of paper and write it down quickly. Li Yi was hurriedly dragged out of the prince's mansion by the young prince who did not look like a young prince at all. Outside the Willow Leaf village, the big man surnamed Fong walked into the village in a daze with a blank face. The few men behind him also looked worried. On the other side of the village, the young servant girl was busy in the kitchen. She was humming a little song that the son-in-law taught her. It was unknown what she was thinking, but the corners of her mouth slightly curled up and her two black eyebrows curved into a beautiful arc. It is almost the Mid-Autumn Festival. When the son-in-law comes back, it is time to make some mooncakes. The young servant girl murmured. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door in the courtyard. The son-in-law is back. The young girl's face lit up with joy. She ran out of the kitchen with light steps, crossed the courtyard, and opened the door. When she saw the familiar face of Fong, the smile on her pretty face became even wider. "Uncle Fong, you are back." After looking around, she found that other than the big man surnamed Fong and the others, there was no sign of Li Yi. A trace of doubt appeared on the young girl's pretty face, and she asked, "Where is the son-in-law?" Fong raised his head and looked at Xiao Huan with a complicated expression. After a long time, he opened his mouth with some difficulty. The son-in-law is missing." "What?" The young girl's delicate body shook when she heard this. After she recovered, her pretty face immediately became pale. Chapter 49. "Miss, it's all my fault. I should have stayed by the son-in-law's side." Master Fong lowered his head and spoke in a low voice. His face was filled with remorse. Lu Rui's expression did not change. After a moment of silence, she nodded and said, "I understand." Unable to read the emotions in her heart, Master Fong and the others opened their mouths but did not say anything in the end. When they left with a sigh, Lu Rui leaned against the door with her sword in her arms. She looked at the almost full moon in the sky and her pretty face was as cold as ever. The young servant girl stood in the courtyard with red and swollen eyes and stared in the direction of the courtyard door. After a long time, she sniffed hard and murmured, "The son-in-law will definitely come back." After an unknown period of time, Lu Rui walked into the room and looked at the woman in the room. She said, "Sister, do you need me to go down the mountain?" Lu Rui knew what she wanted to say and did not wait for her to finish. She waved her hand and said, "There's no need." As she spoke, she looked a little absent-minded. Even though the two of them were not husband and wife, they were husband and wife after all. At this moment, she could not help but feel a little disappointed. Her initial plan was to let Li Yi go after a few days. But as time passed, her thoughts changed. No matter what, she would have to get married in this lifetime. In the past, she had always been busy for the sake of living and had never thought about these things. But these days, that slightly thin figure, in a relaxed manner, had inadvertently carried this family on her shoulders. She no longer had to worry about those things that she needed to worry about in the past. Occasionally, she would think that if he was unwilling to leave and they could continue like this for the rest of their lives, it would not be unacceptable even if the act between the two of them became real. But in the end, this was no longer possible. The Jadeite Courtyard. The name of this courtyard sounded indecent. Just from the name, one could tell that this was probably the same as Yi Hong Courtyard, and Kwai Huo Lu Li Yi suspected that tonight was not just a simple meal. This young prince's way of doing things was completely different from what Li Yi had imagined. He always went out alone without a few lackeys. It was a great waste of resources. But thinking of the scene on the street in the afternoon, Li Yi immediately understood. On the surface, he was alone. Who knew how many people were secretly protecting him? An ordinary passerby or an inconspicuous peddler on the street could turn into the ultimate bodyguard in an instant. Remember, after we go in, don't call me young prince. Just call me brotherly. When they walked to the jadeite courtyard, the young prince named Li Xian suddenly put his arm around Li Yi's shoulder and said in a low voice. Li Yi nodded. He was not surprised at all. People who wandered around in Jianghu used an alternate name to save their lives. When they visited a brothel, they still used the title of Little Prince. If this was spread out, their prince's father would probably break their legs. By the way, I still don't know this brother's name, Li Xian suddenly asked after taking 2 steps. Li Yi. Li Yi looked around curiously and whispered. After living for 2 lifetimes, this was the first time he had visited a brothel. He was a little excited. Brother, your surname is also Li. What a coincidence. Li Xian said in surprise. Although this guy was quite handsome, Li Yi still didn't want to have any fate with him. As soon as the 2 of them stepped into the jade courtyard, a woman in her 30s with heavy makeup immediately greeted them. She squeezed out a smile and said, Hey, isn't this Li? You haven't been here for a long time. Li Yi was stunned for a moment before he realized that the madam wasn't talking about him. Then, he looked at Li Xian with a surprised expression. So this guy was actually a regular here. At this time, Li Yi couldn't help but have some doubts in his heart. Was this guy really a young lord? Don't say anything unnecessary. Where is Miss Suemo? Hurry up and call her out. Li Xian waved his hand and threw her a silver ingot. He said impatiently. Li Yi turned to look at him. Didn't he say that he would treat her to a meal? How did it become a brothel to sleep with girls? His chastity of 2 lifetimes couldn't be casually given away here. If this guy made any unhealthy suggestions later, he must refuse without hesitation. The madam caught the silver and was slightly happy. But then she said with a troubled expression, Li, you know that Zuemo is our top artist here. It's up to her whether she sees guests or not. I can't force her. Li Xian frowned when he heard this. He hated people who didn't do anything after receiving the silver. Seeing this, the madam hurriedly changed the topic and said, however, Zuemo's program is about to start. Why don't I ask her after her program is over? Li Xian waved his hand and said, forget it. I just want her to sing a song to liven things up. Since she is going on stage in a while, it will save me the trouble. The madam muttered in her heart. Every time this Li came to the jade courtyard, he didn't look for a girl. He just wanted to listen to Zuemo sing. It was really strange. However, she didn't dare to say this out loud. After all, this was her financial backer. A thick smile immediately appeared on her face, and she called out, Gentlemen, please follow me to the private room. Drunken Mo will be here soon. The private room that the madam mentioned was a relatively spacious room. The floor was covered with a clean carpet, and there was a space in the middle separated by a curtain. After the madam led Li Yi and Zuemo to sit down, she excused herself and went to work. In front of the 2 of them was a long, short table. There were many fruits and all sorts of dishes on it. Li Xian sat cross-legged on the table. He casually picked up a grape from the table and popped it into his mouth. He glanced at Li Yi and said somewhat smugly, What? You've never been to a place like this before, right? Li Yi nodded when he heard this. It was indeed the first time he had been to such a place. Firstly, he had no money. He couldn't afford such a place at all. Secondly, he didn't have the opportunity. He couldn't imagine what would happen if Xiao Huan and Sister Rui knew that he visited a brothel. After all, he was a man with a family. Following Li Xian's example, Li Yi sat down cross-legged and looked around. There were quite a few silhouettes at the tables around the room. At that moment, they were all quietly chatting with the people beside them. As Li Yi's gaze swept past the door, he suddenly saw a few silhouettes walk in. He could only see that those people were all women, walking slowly into the gauze tent. Miss Zoemo is here. There was a small noise around. Not long after, when music came from the gauze tent, the slightly noisy crowd all shut their mouths. Li Yi also looked with interest at the few graceful figures who had begun to dance in the gauze tent. After a moment, a pleasant voice floated out from the gauze tent. Delicate clouds play tricks, flying stars spread hatred, the silver river crosses in the dark, the golden wind and jade do meet, surpassing countless things in the world. When he heard this, Li Yi's body shook violently, and an expression of extreme shock appeared on his face. Chapter 50. Li Yi was very sure that although poetry also existed in this world, it was only in the same form. Great writers such as Li Bai, Du Fu, Su Shi, and Lu Yong did not exist in the original world. Of course, their works would not appear in this world either. Translator, Lon_editor, Affidatial Li Yi was shocked when he heard the poem, which shouldn't have existed in this world. Then, his shock turned into ecstasy. Could it be that the other party had also transmigrated to this world like him? No one could understand Li Yi's feelings. He was a lonely soul drifting alone in this world. Even if there was a person, no, even if it was a dog from the same world as him, it would still bring the greatest comfort to his soul. Li Xian, who was enjoying the song and dance, did not notice that Li Yi had become very excited. He abruptly stood up and strode to the center of the stage, pulling aside the veil. The woman who was singing with her face covered by a veil seemed to be frightened. Her voice came to an abrupt stop. She looked at the young scholar who had suddenly rushed over with an excited expression. A trace of panic appeared on her face under the veil. Did you also transmigrate from the earth? Li Yi grabbed the woman's hand and asked anxiously. At this moment, everyone in the surroundings had recovered from their shock. When everyone saw what was happening, they immediately stood up, and expressions of shock and anger appeared on their faces. Stop! Let go of Miss Zomo. Who dares to make trouble in this jade courtyard? The young prince, Li Xian, was also stunned, not knowing what was going on. This guy is so impatient. Let go of me, you lecher. When the woman's hand was grabbed by Li Yi, she was really frightened. She stood there in a daze and didn't move at all. However, when she came back to her senses, she suddenly shook off his hand. A look of shame and anger appeared on her face. She took a few steps back and looked at him as she scolded. Li Yi stood there in a daze. Things seemed to be different from what he had imagined. Looking at the girl's reaction, could it be that he had guessed wrong? Right at this moment, the madam ran in with a few strong men, and she cursed furiously. Who the hell is so ignorant to actually dare to cause trouble in the Jade Field courtyard? Quickly arrest him. Those men saw Li Yi standing in the middle of the stage at a glance. They strode over and pressed down on his shoulders. Li Yi allowed the two men to pin his hands behind his back as he glared at the woman. Where did you learn that immortal magpie bridge song? The woman didn't want to pay attention to him, but when she saw the crazed look in his eyes, her heart couldn't help but tremble. For some reason, she opened her mouth and explained, this poem has been known to everyone since a month ago. It is said that it was written on the sky prayer lantern by a gifted scholar named Li Yi. A month ago, the sky prayer lantern, Li Yi. Li Yi muttered a few words, and a look of deep disappointment appeared on his face. It should be Xiao Huan's sky prayer lamp. Hurry up and throw him out. The madam roared when she saw that the men were still standing in the same spot. Stop! Right at this moment, a voice rang out in front of them, and Li Xian slowly walked over with an ugly expression on his face. He walked to the front of the men and said coldly, "Let him go." "Who do you think you are?" one of the men sneered. Halfway through his sentence, Li Xian's expression turned cold. The man only felt his vision blur, and his entire body was sent flying with a kick. At this moment, Li Xian seemed to have changed into a different person. No matter how he usually behaved, his identity as a young prince would never change. How could he let a prostitute from a brothel insult him like this? "You're courting death." The other men's expressions turned ugly when they saw this. Just as they were about to make a move, the madam immediately jogged over. "All of you, stop. Li, what's going on?" She looked at Li Xian with a fawning expression and asked. Li Xian indifferently glanced at Li Yi, who was being held down by the two men. The madam immediately understood. She glared at the two men and said, "Hurry up and release him." Although the madam did not know Li Xian's identity, people like her knew best who they could offend and who they could not. The young man in front of her obviously belonged to the latter. The greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. The sourness in Li Yi's heart at this moment could not be described with words. He did not even have the mood to visit the brothel anymore, and walked out without saying a word. Li Xian looked back at the woman, and a trace of doubt appeared on his face. Then, he turned his head and chased after her. "Hey, brotherly, wait for me." The place where her arm had been grabbed just now was still a little painful. The woman named Drunken Imo looked at the direction in which her face had left and murmured, "That scholar." While she was thinking about something, the madam had already walked over quickly and asked with concern, "Sue Imo, are you okay?" The woman shook her head when she heard this. The madam's heart immediately calmed down. Any accident to the top artist of the Jade Courtyard would be a great loss to them. Whether it was in his previous life or this life, Li Yi had never touched a drop of alcohol, but at this moment, he just wanted to get drunk. A toast to the past, and never look back. The dead were dead, and people always had to look forward. The faces of Xiao Huan, Lu Rui, and even Fang appeared in his mind. Li Yi took a deep breath and strode to a wine shop on the street. "Shopkeeper, bring me the strongest wine you have here." A fat shopkeeper came over and looked at Li Yi with a smile. "Young master, our strongest wine here is too strong. Ordinary people, cut the crap. Are you afraid that I can't afford it?" "Paw." A silver ingot had been slapped on the table by Li Yi. "Okay, wait a moment, young master, the wine will be here soon." When the shopkeeper saw the silver ingot, his eyes lit up and he hurried to the counter to get the wine. Li Xian walked in from outside and sat opposite to Li Yi. He looked at him and sighed, "No matter how beautiful that Miss Suemo is, she is just a prostitute." "Brother Li is a capable man, why do you insist on being a prostitute?" Although they had only had 2 short interactions, it was obvious that this little prince had already developed a lot of interest in Li Yi. If it weren't for this, with his identity, no matter how much he lowered his status, how could he call an ordinary person brother? "Sir, your wine is here." Li Xian obviously misunderstood, but Li Yi didn't want to explain. When the shopkeeper put the wine on the table, he picked up the jar and took a big gulp. Plop. Before falling on the table, Li Yi finally understood why he didn't drink before. Seeing this, Li Xian was stunned for a moment, and then laughed out loud. "I didn't expect your alcohol tolerance to be so poor." He grabbed the jar of wine that Li Yi had just drunk from with one hand and gulped it down a few mouthfuls. Plop. The two of them leaned on the table in the same posture. When the shopkeeper saw this scene at the counter, he couldn't help but curl his lips. "You have such a poor alcohol tolerance, but you still dare to ask for the strongest wine. You deserve it." At the corner of a street not far from the wine shop, a few figures dressed in coarse clothes walked out from the darkness when they saw the 2 people lying drunk on the table in the wine shop. The corners of their mouths pulled into a bitter smile as they walked out. Chapter 51. When he regained consciousness a little, he felt that his whole head was swollen. He tried hard for a long time, but he couldn't open his eyes. He could only hear a few intermittent voices around him. Wang Fei actually ate something in the morning. She also specially drank a small bowl of yam and corn porridge. Wang Ye was very happy. He increased everyone's allowance in the kitchen. When he finally opened his eyes, he felt that his mouth was unusually bitter and thirsty. At this time, a clear voice sounded not far away. "Young master is awake." A hot towel was handed over. Li Yi carelessly wiped his face. He looked at the two maids standing in the room and said in a hoarse voice, "Water." A moment later, he took the teacup from the maid's hand and drank it in one gulp. He still didn't feel thirsty. After drinking a few cups, the feeling of thirst subsided a lot. At this time, a maid came over with a tray covered with a red cloth. She said with a smile, "Young master, this is a thank you gift that Wang Ye asked me to prepare for you. Please accept it." "Thank you gift? What is it?" Li Yi had just woken up and his mind was not very clear. He casually removed the red cloth and was almost dazzled by the neat silver ingots on the tray. "Thank Wang Ye for me." Li Yi took the tray from the maid's hand with a face full of smiles. The trace of drowsiness was immediately swept away and he looked much more energetic. The maid was stunned when she heard this. It seemed that she didn't think that Li Yi would agree so readily. Just now, Wang Ye specifically told her that if the other party insisted on not accepting it, she must persuade him to accept it. For this, she had made a little preparation in her heart. But the real situation made her a little dazed. Didn't they say that scholars regarded money as dirt? This young master didn't seem to be like this. Li Yi carried a small bag on his back and walked out of Ning Wang Fu. He waved to the woman called Yanji behind him and strode away. Last night, he drank a mouthful of wine and was drunk on the table. It was so shameful. He did not wait for the young prince to wake up and could not wait to leave the prince's mansion. There was a total of 110 taels of silver in the small bag he was carrying on his back. Although it was only about 50,000 renminbi, this was indeed the first large sum of money that Li Yi had received since he came to this era. The son of a nouveau riche must have a nouveau riche father. Li Yi liked this kind of forthright prince. It was too troublesome to talk about feelings. It was better to directly talk about money. His wallet was bulging, and even his heart was filled. He just didn't know how anxious Fang and the others would be when they didn't see him yesterday. It was better to return to the stronghold as soon as possible. In the willow leaf stockade, the little servant girl sat in front of the door. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her beautiful big eyes had lost their spirit. She had 2 dark circles under her eyes and stared straight ahead. Not long after, a sturdy figure walked over from afar. The man surnamed Fang held a cloth bag in his hand. He walked in front of the servant girl, sighed, and said, "Xiao Huan, this is the money from yesterday's candied haws. Take it back and keep it well." The young girl did not speak. She bit her lips and shook her head. The idea was given by the son-in-law, and the frosting was also bought by the son-in-law. We only put in a little effort. This money is not safe in our hands. You've better keep it. Fang put the cloth bag at the feet of the young girl. In the end, he did not say anything and turned to leave slowly. The young girl quietly sat in the familiar position. It seemed that there was still a figure beside her. Just like before, he told her those nice stories and taught her how to cook delicious food. That was almost the best time of her life. Thinking that the figure would never appear again, the young girl's nose could not help but feel a little sour. She forced herself not to let the tears fall. After all, she was only a 15 or 16-year-old girl. After an unknown amount of time, the tears in her eyes could no longer be controlled. She buried her little head between her legs and sobbed. Xiao Huan, why are you crying? Who made you angry? A voice suddenly came from the front. The young girl's body could not help but tremble. She suddenly raised her head and saw a familiar face that could not be more familiar. A glimmer of light suddenly appeared in the young girl's eyes, but it quickly dimmed. From yesterday until now, this scene had appeared countless times. From the surprise at the beginning to the numbness at the end, she knew that no matter how real an illusion was, it was still an illusion. Looking at the young servant girl's tearful face, Li Yi's heart could not help but ache. He quickly walked over and wiped the tears off her face. He softly said, "Tell me, who bullied you? The son-in-law will help you vent your anger." The young girl stared blankly at Li Yi, helping her wipe away her tears. The real touch on her face made her realize that this was not an illusion. Son-in-law. In her beautiful big eyes, tears flowed out. In an instant, Li Yi felt that there was an additional delicate body in his arms. The usually shy servant girl would never do something like this. At this moment, she was like a pear blossom in tears. She seemed to be using all her strength to hold on to his body, causing Li Yi to be a little confused. At this moment, the courtyard door opened from the inside. Li Yi saw Lu Rui's figure appear. He pointed at the crying young servant girl and asked, "What's wrong with Xiao Huan?" Lu Rui stood at the door with his sword in his arms. He just looked at Li Yi. Although there was nothing strange on the surface, he seemed to have suddenly relaxed. The appearance of Lu Rui made Xiao Huan stop sobbing. She lowered her head and stood beside Li Yi with a blushing face. She tightly held on to the corner of his clothes, unwilling to let go. "Son-in-law." Fang's loud voice came from behind. Anyone could hear the boundless surprise in his voice. "Son-in-law, you're back." Seeing that Fang, who was so excited that he looked like he had married a few concubines, was about to give him a big bear hug, Li Yi immediately retreated far away with vigilance. He had just enjoyed Xiao Huan's soft embrace. He was unwilling to let Fang touch him no matter what. Fang was not angry that he did not get a bear hug. He looked at Li Yi and asked with a puzzled face, "Son-in-law, where did you go last night?" "Last night?" Li Yi said halfway before he realized that if he said that he went to the brothel to listen to music last night, it would be a little inappropriate. He changed the topic and said, "Last night. Last night, I got lost in the city. I couldn't find you, so I stayed in the inn for the night and came back at dawn." From last night until today, Fang had always thought that if it were not for him, he would not have lost his son-in-law. He was deeply immersed in the torment in his heart and did not sleep for the whole night. It was only when he saw Li Yi today that all his self-blame and regret were swept away. He felt that his life was suddenly filled with light again. Li Yi took down the bundle on his shoulder and handed it to Xiao Huan. He instructed, "Take this back and put it in my cabinet." Xiao Huan stretched out her hand to take it, but she did not expect the small bundle to be much heavier than she had imagined. The bundle accidentally fell from her hand and fell to the ground. Whoosh! The bundle opened up, and a pile of silver ingots rolled out. Under the sunlight, they almost dazzled Fang's eyes. Xiao Huan covered her mouth in shock. Her pretty face was filled with disbelief. Lu Rui could not help but tighten his grip on his sword. His expression changed. Not far away, Madame Wu walked out of the house. She had just poured out a basin of dirty water when she suddenly felt that the ground not far away from her was a little dazzling. She could not help but turn her head to look. Clang! The copper basin in her hand fell to the ground with a clear sound. Chapter 52. As a commoner who was afraid of poverty and starvation, Fang couldn't help but want to convert the silver into grain when he saw it. This had already become his instinctive reaction. But this time, when he saw the fist-sized silver ingots on the ground, Fong felt that his brain wasn't enough to process it. How much grain could this amount of silver buy was clearly beyond the scope of Fong's understanding, since his IQ was limited to adding and subtracting 10. Son-in-law, what did you do last night? Old Fong forcefully shifted his gaze away from the alluring silver ingots. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva with difficulty and looked at Li Yi as he asked. Li Yi glared at the careless maidservant girl and bent over to pick up the silver ingots on the ground one by one. He placed them in his bag and then raised his head to say, "I got lost last night and picked them up on the road." Picked them up. Fong's voice was trembling. This was almost 100 taels of silver. He wouldn't be able to earn so much money in his entire life, yet it was so casually picked up by the son-in-law. Even if he earned 100 copper coins a day from selling candied haws for the past few days, and he could get half of it, it would take several years for him to save up so much money without eating or drinking. As for the young maidservant girl, her beautiful big eyes sparkled with little stars. The son-in-law's luck had always been good. Every time he went out, he would always pick up something. Although it had been a long time since he had picked up a pheasant, he had picked up so much silver this time. Even the heavens were helping the son-in-law. The young maiden's mood had experienced great ups and downs overnight. At this moment, her heart was filled with joy. She secretly looked at Li Yi and couldn't bear to look away. Seeing Li Yi and the others walk into the courtyard, Madame Wu stood there in a daze. She felt as if she had been struck by lightning. Until now, she still couldn't believe what she had just seen. That's a lot of shiny silver. She probably wouldn't be able to see so much silver in her next life. For those poorer families who still had to fill their stomachs, their annual expenses were only about 1 tael of silver. That amount of silver was enough for them to spend for the rest of their lives. After an unknown amount of time, Madame Wu finally recovered from her daze. She picked up the copper basin from the ground and walked into the room in a daze with an unknown expression on her face. 100 taels of silver was not a small sum, and how to spend it was still a problem. Naturally, Li Yi would not be like Fong and the others. The first thing he thought of when he had money was to buy food. Under the situation where there was no shortage of food at home, what he needed to consider was of course how to make the most of the money, how to use the 100 taels of silver to make more money. After all, no one could guarantee that he would always meet a rich man like Prince Ning and his son. Silver was common, but tycoons were rare. If he wanted to earn enough money to enjoy his old age, he had to rely on himself. Originally, he wanted to slowly accumulate enough money through the candied haws, but changes often came faster than he planned. Now that he had some assets, he could obviously skip this step. However, the candied haws business still had to continue. At least in the short term, there was still a lot of profit to be made from the candied haws without any market competition. Of course, there was another important reason. Although the money was nothing to him, it was enough to change the lives of Fong and the others for the rest of their lives. Li Yi did not want to lead the entire village out of poverty and become rich, but Fong and the others were his people. He couldn't just watch them eat dirt while he lived a luxurious life. Li Yi's only dream at this stage was to earn money, a lot of money. At least, it would be enough for him to retire for the rest of his life. As for the specific amount of money, Li Yi did not have a number in his mind. In short, the more the better. With a starting capital of 100 taels, according to Li Yi's previous plan, he could consider purifying high alcohol content or making soap to make money. Before distillation and purification was invented, the alcohol content in this world was actually very low. Most of the rice wine was below 10 degrees, and the highest was no more than 20 degrees. It was only under this premise that it was possible to not get drunk after 1,000 cups. If it was the white wine with 50 to 60 degrees in the future, those so-called wine heroes would have died of alcohol poisoning many times before they could drink 1,000 cups. The alcohol content of the wine that the shopkeeper brought out last night should not be very high. How could it encounter someone like Li Yi who would faint at the slightest smell of alcohol? He was knocked out in one gulp after drinking it. The wine culture was also very prosperous in this world. The higher the alcohol content of the wine, the more they sought after it. Presumably, this would also be an unimpeded way to make money. The sterilization and disinfection of wounds also required high alcohol content. Li Yi still cherished his life very much. If a modern person died from an infected wound in the future, it would be a great shame. Apart from distilling the alcohol, the production of soap had to be put on the agenda as soon as possible. The legendary thing called pancreas, which was used for bathing, was also very rare in this world. Li Yi had specially looked for it in the market of the prefectural city, but he did not see anyone selling it. After asking, he found out that the production method of pancreas was very complicated. The secret recipe was also in the hands of the royal family and very few people. It was a luxury that only a few people could use, and it was basically impossible to see it in the market. Even if it did appear, it would be quickly bought at a high price. Something that couldn't be more ordinary in the future had immediately become a luxury in this world. This was naturally a good thing for Li Yi. In the past, he had also personally DIY handmade soap with the mentality of playing around. It did not require many materials, and the process was also not complicated. Even now, he still remembered the production method. The simplest handmade soap could be made with water, vegetable oil, and sodium hydroxide. The soap made with this method did not contain any additives, had a strong ability to remove dirt, and did not cause any harm to the human skin. Although there was no ready-made sodium hydroxide, it could be easily produced with slaked lime and soda ash. There was no difficulty. After thinking about it in his heart, Li Yi decided to start with handmade soap. He had really had enough of the days where he had to rely on his hands to bathe. As he was thinking about how to carry out this plan, he unknowingly walked into the inner courtyard. Suddenly, he heard a strange sound. Li Yi raised his head and saw a graceful figure moving around in the courtyard. A long sword that shone with a cold light was as agile as a snake. Seeing Lu Rui draw a beautiful flower with the sword and jump several feet away, Li Yi's heart was filled with extreme envy. If he could also have such skills, would he still be afraid of being bullied? If he encountered that scar-faced man again, he could easily deal with him by himself. At that time, with his extraordinary skills and pretty face, wouldn't he be able to become a handsome man with both the pen and the sword, easily gain a large group of female fans, and easily reach the peak of life? Looking at Li Yi's face from afar, Lu Rui sheathed his long sword and resisted the urge to kill him with one strike. Chapter 53. When he was young, Li Yi, like other boys, had dreams of being a wuxia. He had dreamed countless times that he could learn the best kung fu in the world and become a hero. He could fight against the strong and help the weak, travel the world with his sword, and leave a legend of chivalry in Jianghu. Especially after he came into contact with all kinds of wuxia novels and TV series, this idea became stronger and stronger. However, as he grew older, his thinking became less childish, and this idea gradually faded. In the 21st century, there was no wuxia Jianghu. As long as he was an adult with a normal brain, he would not always think about these illusory things like when he was young. But it was different here. In this world, Jianghu really existed. Although, wherever there are people, there is Jianghu, the definition of Jianghu here was very broad. But the Jianghu in this world was a real Jianghu with swords and heroes. Here, individual strength was extremely magnified. Even a small willow leaf village could be called a place with crouching tigers and hidden dragons. Like Fong and the others, they looked like simple and honest farmers, but when they really fought with others, they were all good fighters who could fight against 10. Even his wife and sister-in-law were martial arts masters with extraordinary skills. Li Yi saw them practice kung fu every day, and the little tricks they showed inadvertently would make Li Yi's jaw drop. It was a piece of cake for them to break a wooden table with their bare hands. Li Yi felt that it would be no problem for Lu Rui to break a big stone on her chest. Thinking about it, he still felt that it was not suitable for her to practice. Her chest was already flat enough, and if it was pressed by the stone, there would be nothing left. Li Yi should be very lucky that Lu Rui could not hear what he was thinking, otherwise she would have already taken out her sword and hacked at him. After thinking carefully, Li Yi sadly found that in the whole family, in terms of fighting ability, he could only beat Xiao Huan. As a man, was there anything more shameful than this? No, in the family, there were more women than men. If he was not more domineering and powerful, he would be suppressed for the rest of his life. Rui, Li Yi looked at Lu Rui with a smile, trying to make his voice as gentle as possible. Rui had never seen such an attitude from Li Yi, so he immediately raised his guard against him. He looked at him from afar and made a defensive posture. Li Yi's face darkened when he saw that he was about to make a move just because he called out her name. If not for the fact that he had a favor to ask, he really wanted to turn around and leave. What is it? Lu Rui looked at him and asked straightforwardly. I want to learn martial arts. This time, Li Yi didn't beat around the bush and answered straightforwardly. Practice martial arts. Lu Rui looked at him with a different expression. Why? Li Yi was stunned when he heard that, but he still said honestly, I just want to practice martial arts. I've admired martial artists since I was young, but I never had the chance to practice. No. To Li Yi's surprise, Lu Rui shook her head quickly. Why? It was his turn to be confused. Your aptitude is too low, Lu Rui said bluntly. Li Yi was stunned when he heard that, then he felt indignant. He was a transmigrator after all, and he had the halo of a protagonist. He was destined to be the man who changed the world, and he would succeed no matter what he did. He just wanted to practice martial arts, but he was told that his aptitude was too low. That didn't fit the plot of a protagonist at all. However, it was impossible for him to give up just like that. A thought flashed through his mind, and he looked at Lu Rui and said, why don't we make a bet? No. Lu Rui said straightforwardly, and Li Yi's words were stuck in his throat. Li Yi looked at her angrily. She always didn't play by the rules. Could they still have a pleasant conversation? If I lose, I'll give you 50 taels of silver. If you lose, you have to teach me martial arts. Li Yi didn't care whether she rejected it or not. He really didn't believe that Lu Rui could resist the temptation of 50 taels of silver. Sure enough, after hearing Li Yi's bet, Lu Rui raised her eyebrows, and she seemed to be tempted. 50 taels of silver was indeed not a small amount of money for her, and she could buy many things she wanted. She had never had so much money in her life. However, she also knew that since Li Yi said that, he must have the confidence to win. Based on her understanding of Li Yi, he wouldn't do things that he wasn't confident about. Li Yi knew what she was thinking at a glance. He smiled and said, don't worry. I won't ask you to recite poems or paint, and I won't ask you to do anything difficult. After saying that, he stood up and picked up 2 stones of different sizes from the corner of the yard. He held them in his hands and raised his arms to the same height. He looked at Lu Rui and said, you just need to guess which of these 2 stones will fall first when I let go. If you guess right, I lose, and I'll give you the 50 taels of silver. If you guess wrong, you must fulfill your promise and teach me martial arts. The bet was very simple, but when Li Yi said it, Lu Rui still had some doubts in her heart. Of course, she didn't doubt herself, but she doubted Li Yi's intelligence. When 2 stones fell from the same height, it was common knowledge that the heavier one would fall first. Was there a need to bet? This bet was a situation where she would definitely win. If it wasn't for the elusive smile on Li Yi's face, Lu Rui would have suspected that he was really out of his mind and wanted to give her 50 taels of silver for nothing. She didn't worry that Li Yi would play any tricks. At such a close distance, no matter what Li Yi did, he wouldn't be able to escape her eyes. What, do you dare to bet? Li Yi looked at Lu Rui and said provocatively. Why not? Lu Rui glanced at him and said lightly. She couldn't lose this bet no matter what. Why would she go against the money? Let's make a promise. Li Yi put down the stone and raised his hand. Clap. Lu Rui frowned, but she still reached out her hand and gave him a high five. Let's begin. I'm guessing that the stone in your left hand will fall first. Lu Rui was referring to the bigger stone. Don't rush. Li Yi didn't start immediately. He said with a serious face, I have to get Xiao Huan to witness it. Otherwise, if you go back on your words, who am I going to talk to? Lu Rui couldn't suppress the urge to slash him with her sword again. After a while, the servant girl stood beside them. She looked at Li Yi, then at Lu Rui and said, Young master, second miss, we can start now. After that, she focused all her attention on Li Yi's hands. She couldn't help but sigh in her heart. Young master's 50 taels of silver was probably going to be gone this time. Even Xiao Huan knew that the big stone would fall first. How could second miss be wrong? Watch carefully. Li Yi raised his arms to the same height and revealed an unnoticeable smile. He let go of his hands and the two stones fell to the ground. Bang! 2 stones fell from the sky and hit the bluestone slabs, making only a single sound. How is this possible? Upon seeing this scene, Lu Rui could not help but exclaim in astonishment. Chapter 54. That's impossible. Lu Rui's eyes widened. She was no longer as calm as before as she shook her head. The young maidservant beside her also opened her mouth in shock. She was not any less surprised than Lu Rui. When falling from the same height, a heavy object would definitely fall before a light object. This was a concept that had been deeply ingrained in their minds for more than 10 years. However, the two of them clearly saw that the 2 stones of different sizes had clearly fallen at the same time. You must be cheating. Lu Rui looked up at Li Yi and said with certainty. I knew you'd say that. Li Yi shrugged and said nonchalantly, Try it yourself if you don't believe me. If the law of free fall could produce a different result from Lu Rui's hands, then it would not matter even if he lost 50 taels of silver to her. In another world, Aristotle once proposed the conclusion that heavier objects fall faster, with his enigmatic self-confidence, which dominated the Western academic world for nearly 2,000 years. One day 2,000 years later, Galileo walked up to the Leaning Tower of Pisa and threw 2 iron balls of different weights down. He proved the law of free fall with the 2 balls experiment. Similarly, in the current world, the principle that could be understood with a small experiment was also not discovered because of the ancient people's taken-for-granted concept. Lu Rui picked up another 2 stones to experiment with. When she saw the 2 stones fall to the ground at the same time in her hands, she was stunned. Then, she clenched her teeth and said, Xiao Huan, try it. The reason why the law was a law was that it would not change due to objective conditions. Lu Rui was destined to fail if she wanted to challenge the law of nature. Why? Why is it like this? From afar, Li Yi felt a little guilty as he watched Lu Rui mutter those words in a daze. It was as though the worldview she had built up over a long period of time was beginning to crumble. Was it too despicable to use such a method to deceive a weak lady? No, his sister-in-law was not a weak woman. If such a woman could become a weak woman, then the world would have been ruled by women long ago. You lost the bet. Can you teach me martial arts now? Li Yi walked over and said to Lu Rui with a smile. Why? Lu Rui looked up at him and asked through gritted teeth, why did the 2 stones fall to the ground at the same time? For the current her, winning or losing was not important. What was important was that the creed that had existed in her heart over the years had undergone an earth-shattering change. She needed to know the reason behind it. Xiao Huan also stared wide-eyed at Li Yi, her big eyes filled with the light of curiosity. It was indeed difficult for Li Yi to explain the origin of the law of free fall. Basic physics had not yet been established in this world, and it would be even more troublesome to explain the knowledge of acceleration to them. He thought about it and said, "You can think of it as saying that the speed of the falling stone has nothing to do with the weight of the stone. No matter how different the weight of the two stones is, if they fall from the same height, they will always hit the ground at the same time." This explanation was actually the same as no explanation at all. You only know part of it, don't you? After listening to Li Yi's explanation, Lu Rui looked at him with disdain. As a good young man who had received higher education, how could he be looked down upon by an ignorant woman in a feudal society? Li Yi looked at her and asked, "Do you know where the river flows from the back of the mountain?" "Nonsense, of course it flows down the mountain," Lu Rui said bluntly. "Why?" Li Yi looked at her and asked, "Why does the river always flow down the mountain and not up the mountain?" "Because." Lu Rui subconsciously opened her mouth to explain. However, the moment she said that word, she was unable to continue. Water flows from a high place to a low place. Was there a need for a reason? Li Yi's questions did not stop there. Why do the leaves on the tree always fall to the ground and not fly to the sky? Why can I see my own shadow in the water? Why are the colors of the rainbow after the rain always red, orange, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and purple? One question after another came out of Li Yi's mouth like a machine gun. Lu Rui opened her mouth for a moment and then closed it again. She was completely stunned. In autumn, the leaves on the tree would fall to the ground, one could see their own shadow in the water, and the order of the colors of the rainbow. Weren't these things natural? Did these need to be explained? But, why? Lu Rui and Xiao Huan stood in the courtyard and questions began to appear in their minds. Li Yi's words seemed to have opened the door to a new world for them. It turned out that these small things that they did not pay attention to were not as simple as they seemed. Even in the small things, there is a great knowledge hidden. And in this world, not every problem has an explanation. Li Yi felt a slight sense of achievement as he enlightened the two of them on natural science for free. "Young master, why are these things?" The little servant girl looked up at Li Yi and asked in a daze. Li Yi, since she was willing to bet, she had to be willing to accept her loss. Second Miss Lu's character was still very trustworthy. In the inner courtyard, Li Yi sat on a stone bench and looked at Lu Rui, who was obviously unhappy. He asked excitedly, "Do you know the 18 dragon subduing palms?" "What's the 18 dragon subduing palms?" Lu Rui frowned and asked. "It's the world's most ferocious palm technique. There's a dragon's roar when it's used." The wonders of the palm technique are unparalleled in the world. Li Yi explained with glowing eyes. "I've never heard of it," Lu Rui said lightly. "What about the six-pulse magical sword?" "Gather all the vital qi at the tip of the finger and release it through the air. It can seal the enemy's acupoints at close range and injure people with qi from afar. It's the world's top exquisite sword technique." "I've never heard of it." "Have you heard of the wave-like subtle steps? After mastering it, your body will be as light as a swallow. You can run on walls and walk on water." "I've never heard of this either." "Then you must have heard of Tai Chi. It's used to defeat the strong with the weak, overcome the strong with softness, complement each other with softness, borrow strength to fight strength, and move 1,000 pounds with little effort." After Li Yi finished, Lu Rui looked at him with a frown and said, "I've never heard of anyone in Jianghu who has mastered the wonderful martial arts you mentioned. The 18 dragon subduing palms, the 6-pulse divine sword, the Tai Chi fist." According to what you said, even one of these supreme martial arts is enough to dominate Jianghu. However, no one in Jianghu can do any of them. Let's not talk about other things for now. Just the release of true qi alone is something that even a grandmaster expert would not be able to do. Ah, there's none of these. Li Yi's face showed an unconcealable disappointment. After all this time, the so-called martial arts masters in this world were not just a little bit different from the masters in old Master Jin's martial arts world. Where did you hear about these martial arts? Lu Rui looked up at him with a hint of doubt in her beautiful eyes. It's a long story, tell me about it for now. All right. Li Yi thought for a moment and said, it's said that in the southern Song dynasty, in the last years of the previous dynasty, there were 5 supreme martial arts masters in Jianghu. They fought on the top of Mount Hua for the 9-yin manual, the world's best martial arts book. The battle lasted for 7 days and 7 nights, until the sun and the moon lost their light and the sky lost their color. Chapter 55. Under the warm autumn sun, the handsome scholar lazily reclined on a stone bench. His magnetic voice reverberated in the small courtyard. A story named The Legend of the Condor Heroes had been changed and its background had been reset. This was the first time that it had appeared in this world. 5 ultimate skills. Hua Mountain Sword Competition. 9-yin manual. As he continued to tell the story, the beautiful girl opposite him had an indifferent expression at first. After a while, her expression gradually changed, and she involuntarily fell into the wonderful story. She had been practicing martial arts since she was a child and had always been interested in the martial arts world. However, growing up in the village, she did not have the chance to come into contact with these things. She only heard a few words from other people, and she felt that the so-called Jianghu was nothing more than this. But at this moment, a real Jianghu that matched her expectations was taking shape in her mind and gradually spreading out. At a certain moment, another baby-faced girl walked out of the room and looked at them from afar. She murmured in a low voice, "Young master and second miss, what are they talking about?" A puzzled expression appeared on her pretty face, and she walked over curiously. After a long period of training, Li Yi's storytelling skills had been perfected. If he could no longer make a living in the future, other than moving a table to sell paintings on the street, he could also consider going to a theater to tell stories. Unknowingly, he had another way to make a living. In the Jianghu, it was not a burden to have more skills. Even Lu Rui, an otherworldly woman, could be attracted by him. She was attracted by the stories of old Master Jin, and this made his self-confidence a little inflated. Although Li Yi did not produce stories, and he was only a storyteller, who knew? Lu Rui had never heard of those exquisite martial arts, the martial arts gangs that she had never heard of, and even the names of the top masters in the stories. Although the previous dynasty was decades ago, it was not like Lu Rui did not understand it. The situation of the world back then was different from what Li Yi had revealed. If that was the case, he had fabricated everything out of thin air. However, even though he clearly knew nothing about martial arts, some of his deductions had clearly reached a very profound realm. It even made her feel enlightened. Occasionally, she was enlightened, and her martial arts cultivation even showed signs of advancing to the next level. That's all for today. When are you going to teach me martial arts? The Legend of the Condor Heroes wasn't something that could be finished in a day. Even if he could read the original version in his mind, he would get bored after a long time. Let's talk about this in a few days. Although Rui was still very curious about the development of the story, the most important thing at the moment was to digest those insights. He waved his hand at Li Yi impatiently and hurried back to his room. Li Yi looked at her back in a daze. She left after listening to the story. Didn't she say that she was willing to admit defeat? Burning the bridge after crossing the river, getting rid of the donkey when it was no longer of use. What kind of people were these? In the end, Lu Rui did not leave Li Yi alone. She casually threw him a book about the basics of martial arts and let him practice by himself. Having such an irresponsible sister-in-law, Li Yi couldn't do anything about it. Fortunately, he could absorb the books in the real world into his mind. After absorbing this basic martial art, he could quickly master the moves inside. However, it was just the form and nothing more. The might of these moves could only be revealed when paired with a unique mental cultivation method. Furthermore, it required vigorous inner energy as a foundation. Only having moves but no inner energy in one's body could only be regarded as a superficial display. If one encountered a slightly more powerful opponent, this little bit of skill would not be enough. Unfortunately, the cultivation of inner qi could not be achieved overnight. It could only be accumulated over a long period of time and slowly increased. This made Li Yi's dream of becoming a top master in a short period of time become a bubble. Even so, his learning ability still shocked Lu Rui. She still remembered that it took her a whole month to completely master these basic moves. On the other hand, Li Yi only used less than a day. In terms of the degree of control, he seemed to be more skillful than she was at that time. The difference between a day and a month was like the difference between heaven and earth. This made Lu Rui suffer a huge blow. She could not help but have some doubts in her heart. Could it be that he was really a martial arts genius that appeared once in a century? In terms of poetry and painting, she was definitely not as good as Li Yi. However, Li Yi did not know martial arts. This was one of the few things that Lu Rui could find confidence in from him, but now, she did not even have this confidence anymore. If Li Yi knew what Lu Rui was thinking, he would probably be very proud. However, he could not be proud at this moment. There was no other reason. Since the beginning of autumn, the number of mosquitoes in the room had increased. Unless he kept hiding in the gauze curtains, his exposed skin would be bitten into big bumps after a while. It was not a big deal to be bitten by mosquitoes. It was not that Li Yi had not been bitten by mosquitoes before. However, he did not know the physique of this body that he had transmigrated to. When others were bitten, there would at most be a small red dot or a small bump. However, when Li Yi was bitten, there would immediately be a big bump on that area. It was extremely itchy and unbearable. In the evening, he did not dare to step into the room anymore. He sat on a stone not far from the door. Because of the wind outside, there were no mosquitoes. In this backward era, mosquito-repellent incense had not been invented yet. The most common way to repel mosquitoes was to hang a sachet in the room. The sachet was filled with mosquito-repellent herbs such as agastache, peppermint, basil, calamus, citronella, and so on. Li Yi had also tried this method, but the effect was not obvious. Moreover, Li Yi himself could not stand the smell. He was afraid that before the mosquitoes were smoked away, Li Yi himself would be suffocated to death. If only there was a bottle of 6 Gods floral water. At this moment, Li Yi missed the mosquito-repellent artifact from his previous life. People always know how to cherish things after they have lost them. A box of mosquito-repellent incense and a bottle of floral water could help him get out of the sea of suffering, but this small request could only be extravagant hope. By the way, if there is no ready-made one, I can make it myself. After a while, Li Yi patted his head and said in sudden realization. His head was filled with books from the entire provincial library. Would he be afraid of not being able to find the formula for the mosquito repellent? Chemistry. Lifestyle. The next moment, Li Yi's consciousness sank into his mind. His eyes swept across the rows of bookshelves, and pieces of messy information poured into his mind. After an unknown amount of time, Li Yi suddenly slapped his thigh and exclaimed, "Found it." It was also at this moment that the sound of footsteps came into his ears. When he raised his head, he saw Fang's familiar face. "What's wrong? Were you beaten by your wife again?" Seeing the unconcealable sadness on Fang's face, Li Yi temporarily forgot about the mosquito repellent and asked. Chapter 56. In fact, Fang's wife could be regarded as a strange woman. She usually looked like a simple peasant woman, but when she beat up old Fang, she immediately became a heroine of the generation. Li Yi could feel the thick murderous aura from her even from afar. Although Lao Fang seemed to be troubled by something today, there were no bruises on his face. Presumably, it wasn't because of his fierce wife at home. Fang shook his head, indicating that he got along well with his wife at home today, and sat down next to Li Yi. Then there is something wrong with the Tonghulu business. Li Yi slapped a mosquito that had just landed on his arm and said, "What's wrong? Are there already many people on the street who are imitating our candied haws? How did you know?" Fang suddenly jumped up from the ground and looked at Li Yi in surprise, as if he had seen a ghost. Li Yi flicked away the dead mosquito in his hand and pointed to the front. Fang looked in the direction of his finger and saw several people carrying Tonghulu on their shoulders passing by. When passing by, they looked at Li Yi and Fang a few times, and there was no lack of complacency on their faces. Bah! Fang spat at the backs of these people and scolded, "Shameless guys." This idea was obviously the son-in-law's idea. Why did they also sell Tonghulu? If there was a patent in this world, Fang would have long been unable to help but go to the government to sue them. These people were the direct descendants of Lu's family. At first, they looked down on Fang and the others for not doing the right thing and taking the crooked way to sell Tonghulu. But later, they saw that their lives were getting richer and richer, and even found that Fang's children had become stronger after a few days. Only then did they realize that what Fang and the others were doing was really a money-making job. No one would say no to money. Those who had secretly despised Fang and the others before began to imitate them in a few days and began to sell Tonghulu. The method of making Tonghulu was really simple, and one could understand it with a few glances. Therefore, there were several Tonghulu workshops in the stockade overnight. Although they did not learn some of Li Yi's unique skills, it would not affect them too much if their taste was a little worse. Fang was extremely resentful of their shameless behavior. But he could only be angry. After all, there was no law in the Jing kingdom that clearly prohibited them from selling Tonghulu, which was also what made Fang depressed. "I'm afraid that they are not the only ones who imitate them, right?" Li Yi asked again. Fang looked at Li Yi with a surprised look again. He knew what was going on in the world without going out. He felt that Li Yi was more and more mysterious. He nodded and said, "Since a few days ago, there have been more people selling Tonghulu on the street. Previously, we could sell all of our Tonghulu in less than 2 hours. But today, after shouting for a whole day, there are still half of them left." The Tonghulu business carried Fang's lofty dream, beautiful wives, and a big house. Now, his hope was mercilessly extinguished just as it sprouted. The bitterness was really indescribable. Such a situation was not out of Li Yi's expectation. On the contrary, these things were all within his expectations. Never underestimate the ability of human beings to imitate, not to mention the Tonghulu business, which did not require much technical content. After seeing the business opportunity, it was not strange that so many people would follow the trend. Li Yi did not intend to do the Tonghulu business for the rest of his life. But so far, there was still a lot of profit in this area. He looked up at the man surnamed Fang, sighed and said, "Fang, how many times have I said that you can't do things recklessly? You have to use your brain. Not only can you not marry a beautiful concubine, but you also can't buy a big house for the rest of your life." Fang's face turned red. He looked around and did not find his wife. He glared and said, "Who wants to marry a concubine? My wife is enough." It seemed that it was impossible to count on Fang to use his brain to think of a solution. Li Yi waved to him helplessly and said, "Come here. Next, you have to do this." Fang was overjoyed and hurriedly put his ear to it. After a while, Fang looked at Li Yi with a dull face and could not say a word for a long time. Looking at Li Yi and then at himself, Fong began to have a question in his heart. They were all born and raised by their parents, but why was there such a big difference between them? I think, the son-in-law is not a good person. Thinking of what Li Yi had said to him just now, Fong gave Li Yi a thumbs up with admiration. Get out. Li Yi kicked Fong's butt. Even when this guy praises people, he is so unique. In the next few days, many people in the stockade had already taken selling Tonghulu as their main business. However, after a few days, everyone found that the Tonghulu business was getting more and more difficult. There was no other reason than the number of vendors selling Tonghulu increased day by day. They could be seen on every street in Qing and Prefecture. Under such fierce competition and the fact that their candied haws weren't that outstanding, their business naturally worsened. In the end, they could only sell a few skewers a day. Then, at some unknown time, the number of vendors selling Tonghulu suddenly decreased at an alarming rate. This was because they could no longer buy hawthorn fruits. When they asked the hawthorn peddlers, they learned that just a few days ago, all the hawthorn in the entire Qing and prefectural city had been bought by someone at a low price. In other words, they wouldn't be able to find hawthorn to make candied haws in the short term. This situation did not continue for long. Just 2 days later, a few hawthorn vendors suddenly appeared in the city. Naturally, it quickly caused a commotion among the crowd. Although the price of these hawthorn fruits was more than 3 times higher than before, after they were made into Tonghulu, there was still a certain amount of profit to be made. The crowd cursed the simple and honest-looking men in their hearts for first stocking up and then taking the opportunity to raise the price of the hawthorn fruits. However, they could only grit their teeth and buy. After all, this was already the only place in the city that sold hawthorn fruits. However, because of this, the competition between these people also increased. Ever since the first person began to lower the price in order to sell more, the price of Tonghulu plummeted until 1 copper coin could buy a skewer of Tonghulu. The profits in this business had also reached a freezing point. It was also at this time that a new type of Tonghulu suddenly appeared in the city and once again caused a rush to buy it. The raw material of this Tonghulu was not hawthorn, but fresh, seasonal fruit. It was cut into small pieces, coated with icing sugar, and then skewered. It was even more delicious than the Tonghulu made from hawthorn. This type of loose Tonghulu quickly opened up a market in Qing and Prefecture. Those who were observant noticed that the first Tonghulu to appear in the city came from the hands of these people. And in terms of taste, their Tonghulu was a notch better than the other vendors. This was a kind of brand effect. Even though there were others who imitated the new style of candied haws, it was difficult for them to pose a threat to the Liu family's candied haws. Their simple and honest faces seemed to have become the symbol of authentic candied haws in Qing and Prefecture. Creak. Li Yi had just finished teaching the naughty children. Not long after he returned home, the door to the small courtyard was pushed open from the outside. Fong and a few men walked in with smiles on their faces. Chapter 57. Fong took out a big bag from his back and said, "Son-in-law, this is the money we've earned from selling red fruits and candied haws these days. According to our initial agreement, we'll split it in half. This is the remaining half." It had to be said that Fong and the others were a group of very honest people. Although they were the ones who worked hard to sell candied haws, the candied haws were invented by Li Yi. In the beginning, he was the one who gave them the money. Even when they encountered various problems later on, he was the one who helped them solve them. Without Li Yi, they wouldn't be where they were today. They understood all this. Son-in-law could have done these things without them, but because of his relationship with Miss, he took care of them. Everything was remembered by Fong and the others. At first, when they heard that son-in-law wanted to split half of the profits with them, Fong and the others were shocked at first, then they became terrified. They had only done a little bit of work. What right did they have to take so much? However, they insisted on only taking 10% of the profits, which was eventually rejected by Li Yi. Fong could never imagine that the reason why Li Yi's impression of him changed was because of the two pheasants. Perhaps, all of them should be grateful to the two pheasants. In the courtyard, when Xiao Huan and Lu Rui saw Fong open the bag and revealed the copper coins inside, their pretty faces went blank for a moment. They knew that it was Li Yi's idea, that the big man surnamed Fong and the others had been working on the candied Ha's business these days. They were only a little curious, but they didn't take it to heart. Last time, Fong sent a small bag of copper coins to Xiao Huan, saying that it was the profit from selling candied Ha's. It was about a few hundred copper coins. At that time, Xiao Huan only thought that son-in-law had found a way to make money for Uncle Fong and the others, and they wouldn't have to live so hard in the future. She was very happy. But she didn't expect that they would make so much money in just a few days. If they only sold candied Ha's like before, they naturally wouldn't make so much money. But what Xiao Huan and Lu Rui didn't know was that Fong and the others had been doing more than this these days. First, he listened to Li Yi and bought a large amount of hawthorns, almost emptying out the hawthorns in Qing and Prefectural City. A few days later, he sold them at several times the original price and made a huge profit. Not only that, but even the unripened hawthorn fruits in the back of the mountain were all plucked by them, taking advantage of this craze to sell. More than half of the copper coins in front of him were actually the profits from selling hawthorn fruits. In addition, they took advantage of the fact that the price of the hawthorn sugar-coated Ha's had dropped to the freezing point and there was no longer any profit to be made. They decisively launched a new type of fruit sugar-coated Ha's, which was well received. Before all the vendors could react, they had made a fortune. All of this was, of course, Li Yi's idea. And now, although there were many imitations of the new type of sugar-coated Ha's, because they had long established the loose sugar-coated Ha's brand, they had a natural advantage. Their business was still very good, and every day, their goods would be sold out. Until now, there was a steady income every day. If this business could continue for a long time, their lives would definitely get better and better. They didn't have to go back to the days where they had to worry about filling their stomachs every day. They had meat and rice every day, and their family gradually had a small amount of savings. In a short period of time, they had suddenly moved from the bottom of the Willow Leaf village to a well-off level. Not to mention the tenant farmers who used to be at the same level as them, even the direct descendants of the Lus who had a slightly more well-off life were now far behind them. Who could have imagined such a life in the past? Because of this, these people were full of gratitude towards Li Yi. If it weren't for him, they might still be working for others and living a life where they didn't know the next meal. Have you bought all the things that I asked you to buy in the prefecture? Li Yi didn't refuse the money sent by Fong and the others. After all, in the following period of time, he really needed money. I've bought all the bezoar, peppermint, honeysuckle, spices, and wine. I'll send them to you in a moment. Fong nodded and said. Although he was still very curious about the use of those things that the son-in-law asked him to buy, now Fong admired Li Yi from the bottom of his heart. The things that needed to be done would be done by the son-in-law. As for the rest, he could leave it to him. By the way, there's one more thing. Li Yi looked up at Fong and the others and said, the sugar-coated Ha's business can be handed over to your in-laws in the future. If you have any trustworthy relatives, you can also let them participate. Hearing this, Fong was stunned and asked, then what should we do? The others also had a puzzled look on their faces. Don't worry, I won't let you guys be idle, Li Yi said with a smile. Letting Fong and the others sell sugar-coated Ha's on the streets was really overkill. It was a great waste of talent. What Li Yi was going to do next would be the time where they would really be useful. Although Li Yi didn't explain in detail, Fong still nodded without hesitation. All right, I'll let my in-laws know when I get back. The others didn't have any objections to this. This powerful execution that stemmed from trust left Lu Rui secretly alarmed as she watched from the side. He turned his head and looked at Li Yi with a surprised expression. He had only been in the village for a short period of time, but he had already completely convinced these guys. Not long after, the burly man surnamed Fong and the others walked out of the courtyard. Walking in the village, along the way, many of the direct descendants of the Lu family looked at them with rather unfriendly eyes. There was no other reason, it was because their sugar-coated haws had all gone bankrupt. Nowadays, an ordinary sugar-coated haw could only be sold for a copper coin. The profits were far less than before. Even if it was a copper coin, they couldn't sell much in a day. In the current Qing and prefecture, the faces of Fong and the others were the only indication of authentic sugar-coated haws. Only the Lu family's sugar-coated haws were still as popular as before. Of course, compared to others, their sugar-coated haws had more variety and the taste was more delicious. This was also the reason why the Lu family's sugar-coated haws had always been popular. As for the Lu family's sugar-coated haws, of course, it wasn't a name that just anyone with the surname Lu could use. Even though they wanted to imitate it, the taste they made was far from the others. It was only now that everyone understood that this seemingly simple sugar-coated haw probably had some unique secret method that they didn't know about. If they wanted to make a fortune with sugar-coated haws, they had to get Fong's secret recipe. However, the direct descendants had always been at odds with each other. Of course, Fong wouldn't tell them the secret recipe for free. Seeing that the people they didn't even need to look at when they went out in the past were now living a life that even they were envious of, more of the Lu family members began to regret. If they hadn't been so against Lu's sister Rui, how could this situation have happened? Back then, for the sake of a small profit, they had made things difficult for the Lu sisters. Now, they had lost this rare opportunity to make a fortune. Only the Lu family members could understand how they felt. At this moment, their minds once again thought of the scholar that they had looked down upon. Everyone's hearts were filled with complicated emotions. Chapter 58. Son-in-law, take a look. Did you miss anything? Fong walked in from the outside carrying a large bag, took out the things inside, and placed them in front of Li Yi. Bezoar, peppermint, honeysuckle, spices, a few jars of wine that old Fong had bought from the prefecture city. Looking at the pile of items in front of him, Li Yi counted them and nodded. Old Fong was very reliable. He did not miss out on any of the items that he had been instructed to buy. As the autumn deepened, the mosquitoes became even more rampant when night fell. For this body with a special physique, every night was the most torturous time for Li Yi. Now that the candied haw's business was on the right track, Fong and a few others could handle it. There was no need for Li Yi to worry more. He finally had time to solve the biggest problem that troubled him. Son-in-law, it's not New Year's Day. Why did you buy so much wine? Fong's gaze was fixed on the wine jar on the ground. He involuntarily swallowed a mouthful of saliva and looked at Li Yi. In the past, when the family had no money, there were only a few times a year when they were willing to spend a few coins to buy a bowl of wine at the wine shop in the market at the foot of the mountain to satisfy their cravings. The taste was enough to be remembered for several days. Although he did not have to worry about food and clothing these days and had a lot of surplus, Fong, who was afraid of poverty, was still very thrifty in life. It was easy to earn copper money, but it was harder for him to spend it. Naturally, it was impossible for him to be extravagant enough to enjoy wine and meat all day long. Who said it's not New Year's Day? Li Yi raised his eyebrows, looked back at Fong, and said, "Isn't it the Mid-Autumn Festival in a few days? These days, I have been busy with the candied haw's business. Everyone has worked hard. I will reward everyone." When Fong heard this, his eyes suddenly lit up. "Is this wine for the Mid-Autumn Festival?" "No," Li Yi said very simply. This wine was used to make floral water to repel mosquitoes. He could not let Fong spoil it. Fong's expression froze, and he was speechless for a moment. Ignoring the bitterness in Fong's eyes, Li Yi opened his mouth again and said, "Go find some iron pots and some empty bamboo tubes. We're about to start working." Li Yi originally wanted to postpone the purification of the alcohol for a while and make the soap first. However, his plans could not keep up with the changes, so he had to put the purification of the alcohol first. There was no other reason. To make a mosquito-repellent floral water, it was necessary to use a high concentration of alcohol. Fong was very efficient. He found the iron pot very quickly. Under Li Yi's guidance, it took him half a day to build the alcohol distillation device. Distilling alcohol was not as simple as heating it in a pot. If the temperature was too high, the alcohol and water would evaporate together. After condensing, the alcohol would still be of a low concentration, and it would not be purified. This was a simple distillation device. It first heated the water and used the water temperature to evaporate the alcohol. The alcohol vapor condensed above and entered the bamboo tube. What flowed out was the purified alcohol. Li Yi could easily find the schematic diagram of the distillation device in the book, but the equipment such as flasks and glass tubes could not be realized at present. In desperation, he could only settle for the next best thing and replace it with these simple things in front of him. Although the effect would definitely be a lot worse, as long as he could get alcohol with a concentration of more than 75%, it would be enough. After all the preparations were done, Li Yi ignited the flame below. The next thing to do was to wait. Fong scratched his head. He looked at Li Yi for a while, and then looked at the strange thing his son-in-law asked him to make. His brain was a mess. As drops of wine flowed out of the hollow bamboo tube, gradually, the kitchen began to fill with a strong wine aroma. Gulp. Fong swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Li Yi turned his head and glanced at him. Fong immediately wiped the corner of his mouth and looked away from the bowl under the bamboo tube, pretending that nothing had happened. When the speed of the wine flowing out of the bamboo tube became extremely slow, Li Yi knew that the wine in the pot was almost distilled. He took out a chopstick and dipped it into the bowl. After tasting it, he frowned slightly. Although the alcohol content after distilling was much higher than before, it still did not meet his requirements. It seems that this distillation device is still too simple. If I want to produce it on a large scale in the future and increase the efficiency, I need to improve the distillation device. Li Yi murmured. He poured all the distilled wine into an empty jar and replaced it with fresh wine for the second distillation. Smelling the fragrance in the air, Fong's throat kept trembling. He wanted to pick up the jar next to him and drink to his heart's content. However, he thought that this wine would definitely be of great use to his son-in-law, so he restrained this thought. The alcohol content after distilling was far from enough. The device was simple and crude, and he had to make up for the number of times. Li Yi repeated the distillation over and over again. This way, the alcohol content would increase a little every time. According to the book, using the distillation method to distill alcohol could only achieve a maximum alcohol concentration of about 95%. Of course, it was impossible for Li Yi to achieve such a high alcohol concentration with a few broken pots, but 80% was enough for him. After repeated distillation a few times, Li Yi found that the alcohol content did not increase much. Only then did he give up. Gulp. Fong, who was beside him, swallowed a mouthful of saliva again. Glancing at Fong, Li Yi really could not stand it anymore. He divided a small bowl of distilled alcohol and handed it to him. "All right, don't be greedy. Have a taste of this wine." Hearing this, Fong's eyes lit up. After taking the bowl, he couldn't wait to drink it. Li Yi watched as Fong's face turned from black to red. He let out a comfortable moan. The expression on his face was extremely satisfied. He said loudly, "Good wine." Plop. After saying these two words, Fong's body swayed a few times and fell to the ground, unconscious. Looking at Fong, who was lying on the ground and snoring, Li Yi could not help but feel some contempt in his heart. This guy looked so strong, but it turned out that he was also an embroidered pillow. One gulp and he was not much stronger than himself. Putting the distilled alcohol to the tip of his nose and smelling it, a spicy smell rushed straight into his lungs. In just an instant, Li Yi felt a little dizzy. He quickly moved the wine bowl away. At this time, he realized that the alcohol in front of him was more than 75% alcohol concentration. In the previous world, alcohol with a concentration higher than 60% seemed to be prohibited from being sold in the country. Looking down at Fong, who was lying on the ground, Li Yi could not help but twitch the corner of his mouth. "You're already an adult, but you still can't resist the temptation. You deserve it." Chapter 59. Fong was carried back to his home by Li Yi's men. When he was carried away, he kept muttering, "Good wine." Li Yi clearly noticed that the two men's eyes lit up when they smelled the wine on Fong. At that time, Li Yi mocked Fong a little in his heart, but it didn't take long for him to regret it. He really shouldn't have tricked Fong into drinking the wine. That was a high concentration of more than 75% alcohol. If he didn't sleep until tomorrow morning, it was estimated that Fong wouldn't wake up. If he didn't wake up, Li Yi would have to do the next work alone. Bezoar, peppermint, honeysuckle, spices. Grind all of these things into powder, then put the distilled alcohol in a porcelain bottle and mixed it with the ground powder. Then, shake the porcelain bottle continuously to ensure that they were mixed well. Both bezoar and honeysuckle had the effect of clearing heat and detoxifying. The function of mint was mainly used to repel mosquitoes. As for those spices, of course, it was to make the scent of the floral water smell better. This was a simple preparation method of floral water that Li Yi found in the book. In terms of effect, it was certainly not comparable to the big brands such as Lucien or Longlicky in the future, but Li Yi's requirements were not high, as long as the mosquito repellent effect was okay. According to the book, the concentration of 75% alcohol was mixed with powdered bezoar, honeysuckle, peppermint, and so on, and then kept shaking for half an hour. After they were fully mixed, the residue was filtered out, and the simple floral water was successfully prepared. Thus, when the servant girl came to the kitchen, she saw the son-in-law holding a porcelain bottle in his hand. He looked as if he was possessed, shaking it back and forth. "Son-in-law, what's wrong with you?" The little maid ran over in a hurry and looked at Li Yi with eyes full of worry. If the son-in-law was really possessed, what could he do? Even an Iron Man would not be able to withstand such a long period of shaking. Just as Li Yi was feeling a little dizzy and nauseous, Xiao Huan's figure appeared at the right time. "Xiao Huan, come here quickly and help me shake this bottle." With Xiao Huan's help, he could finally rest for a while. Li Yi looked at the little maid who stood there shaking the porcelain bottle stupidly and did not know what had happened. He thought to himself that when he prepared the floral dew on a large scale in the future, he had to think of a reliable way to ensure that they were fully integrated. It was not a long-term solution to hold the bottle and shake it every time. The two of them took turns, and after about half an hour, Li Yi estimated that it was about time. He pulled out the cork and passed the liquid inside the bottle through a piece of clean gauze to remove the undissolved residue. After the filtration, a translucent liquid was obtained. At the same time, a familiar fragrance began to fill the room. "Young master, what is this? It smells so good." The young maidservant widened her eyes and looked at Li Yi in surprise. "It seems that there are a little too many spices. Next time, reduce the amount by 1/3. Li Yi murmured and put the first successfully prepared floral dew in a new porcelain bottle. The first preparation of floral dew was relatively successful. Although there were inevitably some flaws, as long as he did a few more experiments, he would always be able to find the most suitable formula. Li Yi could not wait to experiment with the efficacy of the floral dew he prepared. Xiao Huan, hurry up and boil water. I want to take a bath later. Yes, young master. The young maidservant looked at the strange thing in the kitchen with some doubts and looked at the back of Li Yi, who left with some joy. Her heart was full of curiosity. What did the son-in-law come up with this time? He poured some floral dew into the bathtub and took a comfortable hot bath. He immediately felt refreshed and his body exuded a faint fragrance. In order to verify the mosquito repellent effect, Li Yi stayed in the corner of the room with the most mosquitoes for a while. The mosquitoes that were willing to be intimate with him were really much less than before. Success. Seeing the mosquito repellent effect of floral dew, Li Yi's face showed joy. This showed that the method of using floral dew to repel mosquitoes was feasible. Next time, he could add more mosquito repellent herbs like peppermint to get floral dew with a stronger mosquito repellent effect. Similarly, if he modified the formula and thought more about the spices, wouldn't the end result be perfume? This was simply killing two birds with one stone. However, for the promotion of floral dew and perfume in this world, Li Yi still did not have much confidence in his heart at this time. In the past, he had read many time travel novels. The protagonists invented various modern items in the ancient world with knowledge that was hundreds and thousands of years ahead of the ancients. They were very popular with the ancients. They counted money until their hands cramped. They had beautiful wives and concubines, big houses, groups of servants, and lived a luxurious and extravagant life. However, Li Yi, who had real experience, deeply understood that reality was far more painful than ideals. Some things were very simple to think about, but when it was really realized, all kinds of difficulties would come one after another. What he needed to do now was to improve the alcohol purification device as much as possible. If the efficiency of each distillation was as low as the first time, it would never work. In addition, he also needed to build a separate processing workshop. After all, he couldn't always do it in his own kitchen. Moreover, after the scale of production was expanded, the small space in the kitchen was far from meeting the requirements. Fortunately, Li Yi still needed some time to improve the distillation equipment and improve the formula. The construction of the workshop was not so urgent. What's more, the location of the workshop, how to build it, and how to operate it after it was built had to be decided after careful consideration. Of course, Li Yi couldn't do these things alone. Therefore, he asked Fang and the others to get out of the candied haws business as soon as possible. Just by selling a few sticks of candied haws, Fang's dream of marrying a concubine and buying a village would probably only be realized in his next life. Li Yi felt that he was born to work hard. He was living a good life as the husband of the village. He had food, drinks, and maids to serve him every day. His life was extremely comfortable. However, he had to look for trouble and lead Fang and the others to a well-off life. He obviously yearned for a pig's life, but in the end, he was as tired as a dog. This was all his own doing. When he walked out of the room, he saw the little maid sitting in the yard. She pouted and kept scratching the mosquito bite on her arm. Hearing the son-in-law calling her from a distance at the door, the girl hurriedly stood up, turned her head and asked, "Son-in-law, what's the matter?" Come here, come here." He waved to the little maid and brought her into the room. He poured some floral water on his hand and wiped it on the mosquito bite on her arm. He asked, "How do you feel? Is it still itchy?" "No, it's not itchy anymore." The afterglow of the setting sun shone into the room through the window. The little maid rolled up her sleeves, revealing her white arms. She lowered her head and spoke softly. Her pretty face was rosy and beautiful. Chapter 60. At present, this newly developed floral water could not be put on the market immediately. Li Yi walked out of the room, thinking about possible improvement plans. When he passed by the kitchen, he suddenly stopped and looked inside with some doubts. Just now, he seemed to have forgotten something. While he was puzzled, the next moment, Li Yi saw a familiar figure coming out of the kitchen. Lu Rui's pretty face was flushed, her eyes were blurred, and she walked unsteadily. Li Yi could smell a strong smell of alcohol from a distance. His face changed slightly, and he quickly rushed into the kitchen. When he saw the empty porcelain bottle on the table, a few black lines suddenly appeared on his face. Looking back at Lu Rui's appearance, he knew without guessing that she must have drunk all the wine just now. I don't know what her alcohol tolerance is. Even Fong got drunk in one gulp of that kind of alcohol, but she can still stand well. When Li Yi thought so in his heart, he looked up and saw that the figure swayed a few times, and then fell head first. A moment later, looking at Lu Rui who fell into her arms and her body became soft, Li Yi couldn't help but twitch the corner of his mouth. Xiao Huan. The next moment, Li Yi's voice came from the kitchen to the yard. The little maid hurriedly ran out of the room. After running into the kitchen, she saw the scene in front of her, and her pretty face showed astonishment. Young master, second miss, what happened? What are you doing? Come and help. Li Yi glanced at Xiao Huan and said impatiently. He really didn't have the experience of taking care of a drunk woman. Moreover, he couldn't do anything. Otherwise, when Lu Rui woke up and misunderstood something, he was afraid that she would directly slash him with a sword. Oh. The little maid responded. Although there was still some doubt on her pretty face, she still walked over quickly. The floral water had been successfully prepared, but before it was officially sold, it needed to be given a resounding name. Let's call it floral water. It seemed a bit too vulgar. As a cultured person, this idea was immediately rejected by Li Yi. Why don't we call them the Six Gods? When Fong, Lu Rui, and Xiao Huan heard Li Yi say this name, they were all stunned. 6 gods. What the hell was this? What's wrong? Is there a problem? Li Yi frowned as he looked at the three of them. What was with their expressions? So what if there were 6 gods? He actually looked down on the name Lucian. It was known that this was the most famous brand of toilet water in the future. In his original world, the name Lucian could be said to be known by everyone. Ahem, young master, there's something that I don't know if I should say. After a moment, it was Fong who let out a dry cough and was the first to break the silence. Then don't say it. Li Yi glanced at him and said. He was obviously a big and rough man who did not know how to read. Yet, he insisted on talking about literature and saying, I don't know if I should say it. Was this something that Fong could say? Fong nodded and said, then I'll say it. This name really doesn't sound good. Li Yi looked up at Fong. He clearly told him not to say it just now. Did this guy not understand what he said? Fong looked at Li Yi with a troubled face. Under normal circumstances, he would not object to Li Yi, but this time, he felt that calling it Fong's toilet water was 10,000 times better than the 6 gods that the young master had just said. Xiao Huan, what do you think? Li Yi turned to look at Xiao Huan and asked. Fong was becoming more and more dishonest. He should learn more from Xiao Huan. No matter what, she would never object to his opinion. Young master, I also don't think it sounds good. The little maid bowed her head and whispered as she rubbed the corner of her clothes. Li Yi, I think it's better to call it Rui Du. At this moment, Lu Rui suddenly said. This name is good. After being stunned for a moment, Fong immediately nodded fiercely. Obviously, he agreed with Lu Rui's proposal. I also think this name is good. Xiao Huan also nodded and said. To be honest, when Lu Rui said this name, Li Yi also had a feeling that his eyes lit up. Toilet water had many effects, such as repelling mosquitoes and relieving itching, cooling and removing heat, sterilizing and disinfecting. Its functions were so powerful that it could be called an indispensable artifact in daily life. It could meet all kinds of daily needs. It was most appropriate to call it Rui Du. However, he looked up at the slightly expectant expression on Lu Rui's face. On second thought, the way he looked at her suddenly became strange. Rui Du, when she thought of this name, did she really not have any selfish motives? Everything about the floral dew was her own credit. Why should it be named after her? Was it a privilege to be beautiful? According to his contribution to the toilet water of this world, it was most appropriate to call it Li Yi Du. Among the 4 people, 3 people's opinions were unified. Li Yi was currently behind by a big score of 3-1. How about calling it 6 Gods Rui Du? He looked up at the 3 people and asked tentatively. Seeing Xiao Huan's strange expression, Lu Rui and Fong had a look of disgust. Li Yi thought about it and asked again, how about Rui 6 Gods Du? The matter of the name of the toilet water was so happily finalized. As a good young man who had received a good modern education, Li Yi finally decided to follow democracy and gave up his insistence on 6 gods. He decided to name the upcoming toilet water as Rui Du. Of course, for Fong's betrayal, Li Yi also indirectly expressed his dissatisfaction. The way he was dissatisfied was when Fong talked to him about life ideals and revealed that he would make a lot of money in the future, build a big house, and marry a beautiful concubine. He did not remind Fong that his wife was standing behind him, planning to call him home for dinner. Li Yi did not know whether Fong had eaten that day, but in the next 2 days, he saw that his walking was a little abnormal. He did not know if it was because he had been kneeling on the washboard for a long time. Originally, he wanted to re-educate the little maid, but when he saw her standing in front of him with her head bowed and pitifully rubbing the corner of her clothes, Li Yi could not say a word. In the next few days, Li Yi once again gave the naughty children a long vacation. Almost all his energy was put on the improvement of the distillation device and the improvement of the toilet water formula. After consulting a large number of materials and documents in the library, there was obvious progress in both the distillation efficiency and the improvement of the formula. As the autumn grew, it was already the middle of August. It was getting closer to the first Mid-Autumn Festival that Li Yi would spend in this world. Chapter 61. In this world, the Mid-Autumn Festival was still one of the most important festivals on the 15th of August every year. The Mid-Autumn Festival, which implied reunion, was a relatively sensitive day for Li Yi. It was easy to evoke some dusty memories in the bottom of his heart. But now, he had learned to hide those emotions in the bottom of his heart, and it would not be easily seen by others. Tomorrow was the Mid-Autumn Festival that Xiao Huan had been looking forward to for a long time. For a simple-minded girl, every festival would be looked forward to a long time ago. After Li Yi taught her to count, the little servant girl would count the days with her fingers. Today, Fong and the others did not go to the street to sell candied haws. It was a festive festival, and they had to take a holiday to relax. In the past, when the family conditions were poor, every festival, they would eat a porridge with a handful of rice grains, and it was considered a festival. Now, there was a lot of money coming in every day. Even if they ate rice and meat every day, there was no psychological pressure. The economic base determined the superstructure. When the family situation was better, the pursuit was naturally higher. When Fong and the others returned from outside yesterday, they had already bought wine and meat and other things, preparing for the Mid-Autumn Festival celebration. Li Yi looked at the things they sent yesterday and actually saw mooncakes. It was called mooncakes, but in fact, it was dough with fillings. After picking one up and tasting it, Li Yi suddenly missed the taste of the 5-kernel mooncakes in the future. Walking on the wide street of Qing and Prefecture with Xiao Huan, the little servant girl blinked her big eyes curiously and looked around. She felt that everything she saw was so strange, but Li Yi's heart was thinking about other things. In the past few days, he had used all kinds of methods to improve the distillation of alcohol. He had also made great improvements to the formula of floral water. Soon, it could be officially produced. Floral water was different from candied haws. Li Yi's initial positioning for it was to go the high-end route. After all, the cost of distilling alcohol was not small. A few jars of wine could make a small bottle of floral water. If the price was set low, Li Yi would lose a lot of money without selling a few bottles. This brought about a new problem. Since it was decided that the floral dew would appear as a high-class image from the beginning, it naturally couldn't be like selling candied haws. Li Yi imagined that Fong was holding 2 bottles of floral dew in his hands and selling them on the street. He randomly grabbed a passerby and said mysteriously, "Brother, do you need Rui dew?" This situation, no matter how he thought about it, felt like he was selling porn or Indian divine oil. Obviously, the roadside stalls were far from meeting the requirements of pretentiousness. If they wanted to do the floral water business for a long time, they might have to add liquor, perfume, and soap in the future. It was essential to have their own shop in the prefecture. However, the difficulty of renting a shop in the bustling area of Qing and prefectural city was no less than opening a shop in the commercial streets of a first-tier city in the future. Just 1 year's rent was an astronomical price for some people. Li Yi specifically inquired about it. Even if the shop was not in the most prosperous area of the prefecture, the annual rent would be 70 or 80 taels of silver. If the shop was slightly renovated, it would cost at least 100 taels of silver. This was a very embarrassing thing for Li Yi at present. His entire net worth was only 100 taels of silver. If he rented the shop, there would be no money to buy liquor and the materials needed to make the floral dew. But if he didn't rent, without the shop, how could he sell the floral dew? Fong and the others naturally wouldn't consider these problems. If Li Yi didn't say it, he was afraid that he would sell the floral dew like candied haws. Anyway, in his eyes, these 2 things were treasures that could make money. There was no big difference. The matter of money couldn't be rushed at the moment. He would find a way to solve it after he went back. Xiao Huan held the 2 pieces of cloth that her son-in-law bought for her to make new clothes. Her eyes were curved into crescent moons, and her little face was full of joy. In the past, there was no spare money in the family to buy cloth. Most of the clothes that Xiao Huan wore were worn by Lu Rui. Lu Rui's figure was extremely tall. Xiao Huan couldn't wear her clothes at all. Lu Rui was taller than Xiao Huan, but the difference was not too big. Xiao Huan could wear her clothes with a little modification. In addition to those rich families, most ordinary families were like this. They took turns to wear the same clothes. Li Yi also saw that the clothes that Xiao Huan wore were all patched, so he specially brought her out today. At this time, there were still no ready-made clothes shops. If you wanted to make clothes, you either bought a few pieces of cloth and went back to make it yourself, or find a special tailor to make it. Of course, the price of the latter would be a little higher. Generally, poor families would choose the first way to make clothes. After learning about these things, Li Yi was slightly tempted. If he opened a ready-made clothes shop here, would he make a lot of money? Of course, at the moment, he could only think about it. He still had a lot of things to do. He didn't have the energy to take care of more things. When it was almost noon, Xiao Huan randomly found a roadside stall to eat something. Not to mention, although the roadside food did not look that fancy, the taste was actually not bad, and the price was also very cheap. The present was not like the future, where one did not have to worry about gutter oil when eating at roadside stalls. Li Yi did not know if it was because of their good looks, but he realized that the stall owner actually gave him and Xiao Huan more noodles than the customers around them. This made him feel a little gratified. After all, him in the past had never thought that one day he could actually use his good looks to take advantage of others. After eating, they strolled on the streets for a while and bought some things. Because it was approaching the Mid-Autumn Festival, there were more people on the streets than usual. It had to be said that the quality of the beauties in ancient times was really not bad. In this era where double eyelids could not be drawn, all the beauties were pure natural. They wore light makeup. Along the way, Li Yi saw many of them. If it was in the future, they would not need to change their clothes to be able to hold up a period drama. Of course, his little servant girl could also be considered a little beauty. Although she was a little young and had a little baby fat on her face, but after a few years, she would definitely grow into a beauty. Towards the resistance of beauties, the current Li Yi was much stronger than in his previous life. The three beauties in his family swayed in front of him all day, which directly caused Li Yi's resistance towards beauties to increase greatly. Even if he met a beautiful woman on the street, he would only glance at her with an appreciative gaze, and then turn to look at other beauties. When he passed by a certain part of the street, he saw a group of people gathered there, making a lot of noise. Li Yi did not have the mood to watch the show, but Xiao Huan looked curiously in that direction. But when she saw Li Yi walking straight past, she hurriedly retracted her gaze and quickly followed him. He actually took out 100 taels of silver. This is a little too generous. Chapter 62. Li Yi suddenly stopped in his tracks. The young maidservant was just about to catch up to him and was caught off guard when she bumped into him. She rubbed her chest in pain. When she raised her head, she found that the son-in-law had turned his head and was looking in the direction of the crowd. 100 taels. Li Yi muttered this number. If he had heard correctly, the two people talking on the outskirts of the crowd had just said these three words. For the current Li Yi, anything related to money was a sensitive word. Even if they were separated by a distance of several zhang, it would not escape his ears. He, who had originally not planned on watching the show, immediately walked over to the crowd with quick steps. Dare I ask, brothers, what is happening here and why is everyone gathered here? Li Yi first bowed to the two people who had just spoken and then asked with a smile. The two people were chatting happily and were naturally displeased to be interrupted. But when they turned their heads and saw that the person standing in front of them was also a scholar, the displeasure on their faces immediately disappeared. One of them smiled and replied, "Brother, you may not know, but today, a few of the poetry clubs in Qingham Prefecture are competing in poetry in Drunken Fragrance Tower. The winner can participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet tomorrow. I'm afraid that not long after, there will be excellent work circulating." Li Yi's clothing, no matter how you looked at it, looked like a scholar. Perhaps it was because of this that the two men dressed in Confucian robes were very friendly towards him. Li Yi had no interest in poetry clubs or poetry meets. This friend had talked for a long time but still had not gotten to the main point. Li Yi decided to give him a reminder. A smile appeared on his face and he pretended to ask carelessly, "Brothers, the 100 taels of silver you just mentioned, oh, that 100 taels of silver is the prize for this competition. At the end, it will be given to the winner of the poetry meet." The other person paused for a moment and then explained. For scholars like them, the main point should be this poetry competition. Money was a worldly possession. The 100 taels of silver was not the main point of their attention. A scholar should treat money as dirt. However, as a fake scholar, this was the focus of Li Yi's attention. It was 100 taels of silver. If he won, he could take it away with him. In this way, wouldn't he be able to pay the rent for the shop? These 100 taels of silver were obviously tailor-made for him. "Thank you, brothers." Li Yi smiled and cupped his hands at the two of them. He then looked at the servant girl standing behind him and said, "Xiao Huan, let's go in." Xiao Huan nodded, followed behind Li Yi, with a look that said wherever the son-in-law was, she would be there. "Brother, please wait." Li Yi had just taken 2 steps when a voice suddenly came from behind him. He turned around and looked suspiciously at the young scholar. "Is there anything else, brother? Do you have an invitation?" "Invitation?" Li Yi's expression froze. "What invitation?" The young scholar explained, "The Drunken Fragrance restaurant has been booked today. Only those with an invitation can enter. That is why we were refused entry. So, we can't go in." Li Yi said with a face of disappointment. He seemed to see the 100 taels of silver in his hands fly out of his arms. That is not entirely the case. The scholar pointed to the front and said, "You can go in without an invitation. However, you need to guess the riddles correctly." Li Yi felt a little depressed as he watched this man speak so slowly. He was so wishy-washy and not manly at all. If he had something to say, he should have said it quickly. If he only said half a sentence at a time, it would be easy for others to misunderstand. If that is the case, then guess the riddles before going in. Guessing riddles was something that Li Yi had played since he was young. He had much more experience than these ancient people and did not need to cheat at all. The 2 men looked at each other and said with a wry smile, "These riddles are problems that were not solved during last year's Lantern Festival. If they were so easy to solve, we wouldn't be waiting outside the door. Whether we can guess it or not, we will know once we try." Li Yi smiled and held Xiao Huan's hand as they walked to the front. At the front of the crowd, people were surrounding a few red lanterns and arguing endlessly. At the bottom of the lanterns were white strips of cloth with riddles written on them. "A white snake crosses the river, a red sun above its head." Li Yi looked at the strips of cloth at the bottom of the lanterns. His expression did not change, but he was cursing in his heart. What kind of stupid riddles was this? There were no hints and it did not say whether it was a word puzzle or a guess. How could people guess it? Wasn't this deliberately making things difficult for people? At the side, some people guessed that the answer was boat, while others guessed Dan. However, the manservant standing at the side did not respond. Obviously, they did not guess the correct answer. Li Yi originally wanted to rely on his intelligence to guess riddles, but now he could not count on it. Cheating was the right way to go. With a thought, a thick book of ancient and modern lantern riddles appeared in his mind. Li Yi did not believe that this book, which was as thick as an encyclopedia, would not have this stupid lantern riddle. Searching according to the first word, white, snake. A white snake crosses the river, a red sun above its head. Found it. In just 10 seconds, a smile appeared on Li Yi's face. He waved to the manservant and waited for him to come over. He smiled and said, "A white snake crosses the river, a red sun above its head." The answer to this riddle is oil lamp. The surrounding crowd was stunned at first and then immediately burst into an uproar. What oil lamp? Even if it is a blind guess, it should be an accurate one. Exactly, what does the white snake, red sun, and oil lamp have to do with each other? If you have guessed it, get out of the way. Don't block the way. A few people were not polite with their words. They had racked their brains for so long and still could not guess it correctly. Why was a newcomer joining in the fun? Young master is very talented. The answer to this riddle is the oil lamp. The manservant was stunned for a moment. Then, a surprised expression appeared on his face as he immediately bowed and said, "What? He actually guessed it correctly. Why is it an oil lamp? I know. The wick is the white snake, and the flame, isn't it the red sun?" This riddle was actually very common. However, because there were no hints, the range of guesses was too wide. If one did not have a flash of inspiration, it would be very difficult to think of the oil lamp. When Li Yi said the answer to the riddle, people quickly figured it out. It turned out that the answer was actually so simple. Many people immediately beat their chests and stamped their feet. While sighing at this scholar's good luck, they were also very regretful that they did not think of this earlier. The two scholars who were chatting with Li Yi looked at this scene with their mouths agape. It was hard to imagine that he actually guessed it correctly. "Can I go in now?" Li Yi looked at the manservant and asked. "Young master, please." The manservant hurriedly extended his hand and made an inviting gesture. Li Yi waved to the young girl behind him and said, "Xiao Huan, let's go in." The young servant immediately nodded. The young master was really amazing. He even guessed the riddle that so many people could not. Xiao Huan saw the oil lamp every night and did not think of it. A pleasant smile appeared on her face. Just as she was about to follow Li Yi in, the manservant quickly caught up and blocked the two of them. With a troubled expression, he said, "Young master, you can only go in alone." "Why?" Li Yi looked at him and asked with a frown. Hearing this, Xiao Huan immediately grabbed the corner of Li Yi's clothes worriedly. Xiao Huan did not want to be separated from the young master. Because young master only solved one riddle. "According to our rules, only you can go in alone," the manservant explained patiently. Chapter 63. The servant's explanation was very clear. This place implemented a one-person one-vote system. If Li Yi wanted to bring Xiao Huan in, he had to guess another riddle. The matter of money was important. Naturally he could not break other people's rules. Li Yi walked back to the front of the lanterns. There seemed to be an invisible aura around him. The surrounding people all made way for him. A black dragon on the wall, covered with 10,000 golden stars. Other than this sentence, there was still no other explanation. The crowd guessed for a long time, but still could not guess the answer. At this time, almost everyone's gaze was on Li Yi. Of course, most of them had the mentality of watching a joke. The first time may have been a coincidence, the second time, would he still be as lucky as before? After a while, Li Yi spoke again. "The answer to this riddle is pole scale." With the ancient and modern lantern riddles in his hands, what riddle could he not guess? "Congratulations, young master. Now young master can bring this lady in." The servant's following actions proved that the answer Li Yi gave was correct. After Li Yi spoke, a few people's faces showed confusion. Very quickly it turned into understanding. "I see. Comparing the pole scale to a black dragon, then the pole scale is 10,000 golden stars. Ashamed to think that I have read so many books, but I can't even see through these two little riddles. I am so ashamed." Actually, something like guessing lantern riddles, to a certain extent, had nothing to do with literary talent or profound knowledge. It only relied on a flash of inspiration, or a cheating device like Li Yi's. This kind of person who did not even delineate the scope of the riddles, and only placed one sentence there for people to guess blindly, was not a good person. Most likely, his intention was to deliberately make things difficult for people. At this time, the surrounding people's gazes towards Li Yi had changed. Guessing one might be a fluke, but to be able to guess the second so easily, the possibility of it being a fluke was not high. It could only mean, this handsome scholar in front of them, most likely had some ability. Very quickly, Li Yi used his actions to prove to them how correct these people's thoughts were. He, who had originally planned to bring Xiao Huan in, glanced at the two scholars who had just enthusiastically introduced him, and immediately felt that it was a little impolite to just leave like that. He walked over and smiled to the two brothers. "Why don't we go in together?" The expressions on the two people's faces froze, and before they could regain their senses, Li Yi had already walked to the two remaining lanterns, raised his head to look and read, "The bright moon half rests under the cloud's feet, withered flowers fall before the horse's hooves, the answer to this riddle should be the word bear. As soon as he said that, everyone looked at him as if they were looking at a monster. How could they tell that it was the word bear? There was no connection at all. Li Yi did not stop because of the uproar, his gaze was already on the last lantern. Not long after, he opened his mouth again. 2 rows of distant trees stand on the side of the mountain, a small boat and a leaf flow horizontally. This is also a word riddle. The answer to the riddle is the word intelligence. There was already no one around to speak, and their gazes towards him were filled with a strange expression. Undeniably, he had guessed the first 2 riddles, but for the last 2, what was he guessing? The bright moon half rests under the cloud's feet, withered flowers fall before the horse's hooves. What did this verse have to do with the word bear at all? 2 rows of distant trees stand on the side of the mountain, a small boat and a leaf flow horizontally. Where did he see the word intelligence? However, when the crowd glanced over, they saw that the servant was standing there in a daze, and his expression was as if he had seen a ghost. Their expressions also gradually changed. Could it be he had really guessed correctly? Everyone, please. After an unknown amount of time, the servant finally regained his senses and involuntarily swallowed a mouthful of saliva. He respectfully made a gesture towards Li Yi and the others to invite them in. He knew better than anyone that these lantern riddles were a gimmick created by those people to attract others. Without any hints, no one would be able to guess them. But the truth was, these extremely difficult lantern riddles were all solved by the scholar in front of him. If it was just one riddle, it would have been fine, but he just had to solve all the riddles. This was clearly ruining the place. However, with so many people staring at him, he naturally could not say that he was going back on his words. Even though he was shocked beyond belief, he still respectfully invited Li Yi and the others to enter. At this moment, those who had painstakingly guessed the riddles for a long time could no longer describe the feelings in their hearts. He had actually guessed all of them correctly. He had only pondered over each riddle for a few breaths of time. In comparison, what had they been doing for such a long period of time? Moreover, if it was an ordinary person, guessing 1 riddle was enough. Guessing 2 was also forgivable. But what was the point of guessing so many? If you took up all the spots, how could you leave a way out for others? Seeing the scholar and the others enter the restaurant, the crowd looked at the lanterns that the servant had already taken down. This meant that they would no longer have the chance to enter. Instantly, they wanted to cry but had no tears. At this moment, Li Yi, Xiao Huan and the 2 scholars who had yet to regain their senses had already entered the restaurant. "Thank you, brother." After the 2 of them regained their senses, they immediately cupped their fists and thanked Li Yi. Today, in this restaurant, other than those participating in the competition, naturally, there were other people who were also invited. After all, since ancient times, there was no first place in literature. If there were only those from the poetry clubs, it was likely that no one would accept the other and they would not be able to argue who was better by the next day. These invited people would all evaluate the poems that had been produced today and use that to determine the winner. And if it were not for Li Yi, the 2 of them would not even be qualified to enter this place. These scholars were always thanking one another and it was not interesting at all. After waving his hand, Li Yi began to look at the situation in front of him. The space in this restaurant was much larger than he had imagined. Just the hall on the first floor alone had about a dozen people. As for the upper floor, there were also figures moving about. Even with so many people accommodating so many people, it still seemed very spacious. On the table at the side, there were some vegetables, fruits, pastries and other snacks. They looked quite exquisite and could be used as dessert after the meal. Just when Li Yi was about to taste a piece of fruit and vegetable, a few steps away, an extremely beautiful woman spread out a square handkerchief in her hand and distributed the exquisite pastries to the women beside her. Li Yi sniffed and his expression suddenly changed. He looked in the direction of the fragrance. The service here is quite good. Even a maid is so beautiful. Hey, the pastries in her hand look delicious. Li Yi was surprised and sighed in his heart. Then, he quickly walked over. There were originally only a few pieces of the pastries. After being distributed by the women, there were only 2 pieces left. Li Yi was afraid that the last 2 pieces would be taken away by others if he was too late. Thus, he quickened his pace again and walked to the pretty maid. Then, he imitated those women and stretched out his hand. Looking at the slender and fair palm that suddenly appeared in front of her, the pretty maid was slightly stunned. She raised her head and looked at Li Yi with a blank expression. At the same time, the women around her also showed astonished expressions. That brother actually knows Miss Wan. Not far away, the 2 scholars brought in by Li Yi looked at each other and murmured. Chapter 64. Young master, you want this? The pretty maidservant looked at Li Yi with a blank expression. After being stunned for a moment, she pointed at the pastry in her hand and asked with some uncertainty. Her voice was soft, extremely pleasant to the ears. No matter how beautiful other maids were, it had nothing to do with him. Li Yi was only interested in the fragrant pastry in her hand. Seeing that she was so decisive in distributing the pastry to the other girls, when it was him, the other party seemed to be unwilling, he felt slightly dissatisfied. Could it be that this beautiful maid had the thought of valuing females over males? Li Yi looked at her and nodded with absolute certainty. He thought that if she rejected him, he would definitely find her leader to complain about her. Futile thinking must not be tolerated. That girl was stunned for a moment and raised her head to look at the scholar in front of her. Seeing that he did not seem to be joking, she really handed over the silk handkerchief in her hand. Xiao Huan, come and try this. Li Yi stretched out his hand and took the remaining 2 pastry from the silk handkerchief. He turned his head and beckoned to the young maid. He had never been a person who ate alone. This pastry smelled pretty good. Coincidentally, Xiao Huan liked sweet food. He had to let her have a taste. After walking 2 steps, he suddenly turned his head and said, "Thank you," to the maid who was standing dumbfounded on the spot. Then he turned and left. The maid stared at Li Yi's back, and the confusion on her face deepened. "Ruoqing, you know that scholar?" A girl beside her asked with some confusion. The surprised expression on her face was still there. The girl called Ruoqing shook her head and said, "I have never seen him before." What? When the other girls beside her heard this, they all revealed an extremely surprised expression. Then why did he? This scholar is so strange. Yes, I have never seen such a person. Even if Ruoqing tried very hard to recall, she did not have any impression of that scholar. After a moment, she finally confirmed that she did not know him before. But if they didn't know each other, then his action of asking for the osmanthus cake just now was a little hard to see through. The etiquette between men and women had been developed very well in this era. Even men who were familiar with her would stand at attention and bow to her when they saw her. As for reaching out to ask for the osmanthus cake, it was impossible for them to do such a thing. Therefore, when that unfamiliar scholar reached out to her, Wan Ruoqing felt somewhat at a loss and didn't know what to do. Even now, she still couldn't figure out why she had reached out her hand just now. "Ruoqing, I remember that Zuemo told us to leave 2 pieces for her. She likes the osmanthus cake you make the most." After a while, a woman beside the pretty woman came back to her senses and seemed to have thought of something. She turned to look at her and said with a strange expression, "Ah." When the beautiful woman named Wan Ruoqing heard this, she couldn't help but let out a soft cry, and a remorseful expression appeared on her pretty face. At this time, everyone's eyes couldn't help but look at the scholar who was talking and laughing with the pretty girl not far away, and the expression on their faces was extremely strange. Li Yi still didn't know that in the eyes of these strange women, he had completely lost his gentlemanly demeanor. Perhaps he would be labeled as shameless. The taste of the nameless cake just now made his eyes light up. He thought in his heart that he would ask the maidservant where she bought the cake later. When he was planning this in his heart, he suddenly felt something. Looking back, he found that the beautiful maidservant and the women around her were looking at him with strange eyes. Seeing this, Li Yi couldn't help but be slightly stunned, and was a little surprised in his heart. Although the cake was indeed delicious, they didn't have to be so distressed, right? He shook his head and stopped thinking about these things. He turned to look at Xiao Huan and asked with a smile, "How is it? Is the cake delicious?" The young maidservant's eyes had already turned into crescent moons. To her, the happiest thing was to have such a cake to eat every day. So this brother is actually acquainted with Lady Wan and the talented women of the Yuning society. My apologies, my apologies. At this time, the two scholars who had just come in with Li Yi walked over and looked at Li Yi with envy. Who is Lady Wan? Hearing this, Li Yi was first stunned, then he asked with some confusion. He had never even heard of Lady Wan from the Yuning society. Brother, don't joke around. The two looked at Li Yi and spoke with strange expressions. Before waiting for Li Yi to speak, one of them spoke again. Although Lady Wan is an outstanding actress, her literary talent is so great that even we cannot compare. Even those famous scholars would not look down on her because of her identity. This brother is acquainted with Lady Wan. This is not a shameful matter, why hide it? This time, Li Yi was really a little confused. The two of them had said so much, but he still did not understand what they were saying. He really did not know this Lady Wan. As for discriminating against outstanding actresses, how could there be such a thing? The outstanding actresses of ancient times were equivalent to the actors of the future. The difference was that the status of the two was worlds apart. The latter often enjoyed the treatment of the moon surrounded by the stars, while the former had a lower status. They belonged to the untouchables outside of the scholars, farmers, and merchants. In the eyes of the ancients, their status was even lower than dog shit. There was an old saying, prostitutes are heartless, and entertainers are unjust. The entertainers in this saying referred to outstanding actresses. This showed how much the ancients looked down on this profession. But what did this have to do with him? He was a well-educated youth of the new era. His three views were righteous and he advocated equality for everyone. Why did he look down on outstanding actresses? If it was in the future, they would all be celebrities. They were rare. Who is this Lady Wan you are talking about? Li Yi looked at the two of them and asked sincerely. This time, it was the two of them who were confused. They pointed at the beautiful servant girl not far away and said, "That is Lady Wan." What? Li Yi's eyes widened and he almost blurted out, "Isn't that the servant girl of Drunken Fragrance Brothel? How could Lady Wan be a servant girl? Moreover, aren't the women beside her the talented ladies of Yuning society?" A scholar looked at Li Yi and said with some astonishment. Li Yi held on to the table beside him and felt a little confused. So, that person just now wasn't a servant girl here. That pastry wasn't the restaurant's buffet either. She brought it here herself. No wonder she and the women around her looked at him so strangely. After all this time, they all knew each other. In an instant, Li Yi felt his face turn red and he felt unwell. Even in the future, his skin was not thick enough to ask a stranger for a snack on the street. But just now, he actually did it. Most importantly, the other party really gave it to him. He involuntarily raised his head and looked in that direction. Coincidentally, the woman's gaze also looked over. The moment their eyes met, Li Yi's expression was extremely awkward. Chapter 65. At this moment, even the matter of the 100 taels of silver was temporarily thrown to the back of Li Yi's mind. He couldn't blame anyone else for making such a mistake. He could only blame himself for not being able to control his mouth. In his previous life, Li Yi was a moderate foodie. He had a great desire for good food and had eaten all kinds of famous snacks. After coming to this world, in a situation where food was extremely scarce compared to his previous life, it was not easy for him to come across a pastry that could arouse his appetite. His foodie heart began to lose control. And then, it was embarrassing. Encountering such an embarrassing situation, Li Yi's gaze was already too embarrassed to look over there. As for the women, after experiencing this small episode, they finally put away their curiosity about Li Yi. They gathered in the small space that belonged to them and began to talk in low voices. After all, today's small poetry competition was what they needed to focus on. Because today's victory or defeat directly affected whether or not they had the right to participate in tomorrow's Mid-Autumn Poetry Competition. For the many scholars of Qing and Fu, this was a kind of recognition of strength and status. Although they were women, they also wanted to compete with the men. Today, we have Ruoqing here. The other poetry clubs are nothing to worry about. Only the Eastern Li and White Du poetry clubs cannot be underestimated. Su Wendian and Fang Zhou are both very good at mid-autumn poems. We still have to be careful. A slightly older woman looked at the two poetry clubs and spoke in a slightly serious tone. Su Wendian is one thing, but that Fang Zhou's poetry is extraordinary. The poem he wrote on the 7th day of the lunar month actually entered the top 10. If it wasn't for Sister Ruoqing, then he would have won first place at the poetry competition, another girl with an oval face said. Wan Ruoqing smiled and said, "What does this have to do with me?" "What do you mean it has nothing to do with you?" The girl argued with a smile. If it wasn't for Sister Ruoqing taking out the immortal magpie bridge, then wouldn't the first place have been taken by that Fang guy? Immortal magpie bridge. The girl's words seemed to make Ruoqing sink into some kind of memory. A look of regret appeared on her pretty face. Su Wendian cannot be underestimated. The older woman looked at the young girl, shook her head, and said, "In terms of Qixi poetry, Su Wendian might not be as good as Fang Zhou, but the styles of Qixi and mid-autumn poetry are completely different. Fang Zhou's Qixi poetry might not be better than his mid-autumn poetry. In last year's mid-autumn poetry meet, he lost to Su Wendian. He, what are you afraid of? We have Sister Ruoqing." The girl said disapprovingly, "Sister Ruoqing, go and see if there are any more sky prayer lanterns falling outside. Maybe you can pick up another mid-autumn festival poem that will scare them to death." When the women heard this, they smiled helplessly. A poem of this level was enough to be passed down through the ages. How could it be picked up so easily? At this moment, as if remembering something, the young lady suddenly said, "Do you guys think that the scholar who composed the Immortal Magpie Bridge will also participate in the poetry meet tomorrow?" As soon as the girl said this, Ruoqing's eyes suddenly lit up. "I'm afraid not." The older woman shook her head and said, "Once the Immortal Magpie Bridge appeared, there were no more Qixi poetry poems. The #1 scholar of Qing and Prefecture, who had always been an expert in Qixi poetry poems, tore up his own poem and said that he would never compose another Qixi poetry poem in his life. After that night, countless people searched for the scholar named Li Yi, but no one saw him. Could it be that the poem was really composed by an immortal from heaven?" The girl's eyes flashed with an inexplicable light as she murmured, "Silly girl, you only know how to think. How can there be an immortal in this world?" A woman beside her lightly knocked on her head and said unhappily. The older woman seemed to think of something and suddenly turned to look at Ruoqing and asked, "Right, didn't Ruoqing have news of that scholar named Li Yi? What happened after that?" Wan Ruoqing shook her head and said, "Drunken Mo and I went to ask the scholar who painted for her. The scholar said that the painting wasn't made by him and that he only met that person once. The older woman nodded and said, "I've seen that painting before." It's hard to imagine that the art of painting could reach such a level. The so-called 3 parts of wood is nothing more than this, isn't it? That scholar named Li Yi can be said to be a master of both poetry and painting. If I can meet him, it would be a great regret in my life. Wan Ruoqing smiled and said, "Drunken Mo has been hugging that painting and studying it these days and has had a small breakthrough. She talks about it all day long, probably hoping to see that person tomorrow." Of course, Li Yi didn't know that this immortal magpie bridge had won him the hearts of countless women. He already had many female fans in this world who saw him as a soulmate. It was likely that with just a word from him, there would be countless girls who would offer themselves to him, pledging their lives to him. In this world, don't underestimate the attractiveness of those scholars to women. Those famous scholars were almost equivalent to the Korean oppas in the hearts of the die-hard young girls in the future. And Li Yi was the most popular type. His influence was evident. Of course, Li Yi still didn't know about these things. Because of the blunder just now, his mood wasn't too good. If it wasn't for the fact that he really couldn't bear to part with the 100 taels of silver, he probably would have left with his servant girl. He had never done such an embarrassing thing in his 2 lives. So embarrassing. The servant girl on the side saw that Li Yi wasn't in a good mood and said softly, "Young master, how about we go home? Wait a little longer." Li Yi shook his head and said. He had already lost face and urgently needed 100 taels of silver to comfort himself. So even if he would be embarrassed when he saw those girls, Li Yi still didn't plan to leave this place. What stupid poetry gathering, why hasn't it started yet? Li Yi thought gloomily and stood up to find someone to ask. When he walked to the door, 2 figures walked in from outside. The beautiful girl in front had just stepped through the door when she saw a young man dressed like a scholar walking in her direction. Her footsteps suddenly stopped and the expression on her face froze for a moment. Then, anger emerged. "It's you." A rebuke that was suppressing her anger suddenly came from her mouth. The 15 or 16-year-old girl behind the girl was also stunned. She didn't know what had made the young miss so angry. Li Yi was also stunned. He raised his head and looked at the unfamiliar girl in front of him. He was a little confused. Is she talking to me? But I don't know her. Lecture. The woman pointed a slender, jade-like finger at him. Her pretty face was filled with anger. Li Yi was really a little confused. What lecture? Do we know each other? The meaning of lecture seems to be the hoodlums and perverts of the future, scolding someone the first time they met. Is this girl crazy? Chapter 66. The beautiful lady's eyes were wide open, pointing at Li Yi and cursing lecture. Her face was full of resentment, looking as though her innocence had been violated. Those who didn't know the truth might really think that Li Yi had done something outrageous to her. At least, that was what Li Yi and the 2 scholars beside her thought. The 2 of them stared blankly at this scene, as though they had been struck by lightning. They were completely stunned. Although they hadn't been in contact with Li Yi for a long time, his performance of solving the riddles outside the door just now had already deeply impressed them. Looking at his mannerisms, they could see that he was quite a gentleman, and the reason why they were qualified to enter was all because of his help. Such a person, no matter how they looked at it, didn't seem like a lecher. Of course, compared to their suspicions of this righteous brother's character, they were even more surprised by the identity of the lady. The leading courtesan of the Jade's courtyard, how many people wanted to get intimate with her, but no one had ever gotten their wish. Lady Zuamo, who was pursued by countless men, was actually taken advantage of by someone. If this was known by those scholars who were interested in her, who knew what would happen? The 2 of them opened their mouths and felt that their throats were a little dry. When they looked at Li Yi again, their eyes couldn't help but reveal a strong sense of envy. Because he had done something that many men, including them, dreamed of. And standing behind Li Yi, Xiao Huan, who also didn't know what was going on, also looked at the lady in confusion, still wondering what "lecture" meant. And what was strange was that this beautiful lady in front of her, why did she feel a sense of familiarity? The little servant girl thought for a long time, but still couldn't figure out where she had seen her before, and couldn't help but feel even more puzzled. At this time, Li Yi also finally realized that things weren't going well. A normal woman definitely wouldn't point at a stranger's nose and scold "lecture." Looking at this lady's appearance, it didn't seem like she was mentally unstable. What made him feel even more guilty was that this lady in front of him actually gave him a vague sense of familiarity. This beautiful face, he seemed to have seen it somewhere before. However, he had only been in this world for a short period of time. He had spent most of his time in the village and had almost no contact with the people outside, let alone the women outside. Of course, the middle-aged woman who had haggled with him for an hour didn't count. However, this feeling was real. Suddenly, a light flashed in Li Yi's mind, and he suddenly thought of a possibility. Could it be that she knew the previous owner of this body? Looking at the woman's resentful expression, she looked very much like a resentful girl who had been abandoned. Could it be that the previous owner of this body slept with the girl and didn't pay? The more Li Yi thought about it, the more likely it was. He couldn't help but curse that bastard in his heart. He felt good about leaving such a mess to him. Now that the girl had bumped into him, what should he do? Li Yi was just an innocent virgin who had no experience in relationships in his 2 lifetimes. He really didn't know how to deal with this kind of thing. And at this time, the abnormality here had attracted the attention of many people in the hall. Isn't that Miss Suemo? She actually came today. Miss Suemo has always been on good terms with the Yunying Poetry Club. It's not strange for her to appear here. But who is that scholar? He seems to be acquainted with Miss Suemo. I saw him and Miss Wan talking for a while just now. He must be a scholar with some fame, but why does he look so unfamiliar? Because of the distance, the crowd didn't know what exactly happened here, but they were quite curious about the identity of the strange scholar. After all, Miss Suemo had always been arrogant and rarely saw her interact with men. But looking at the current situation, she seemed to have a close relationship with the strange scholar. Suemo, what's wrong? A gentle voice came from behind. Li Yi saw the beautiful woman called Miss Wan, and a few people from the Yunying Poetry Club hurrying over, standing next to the woman who called him a "lecture." When the women from the Yunying Poetry Club saw Miss Suemo's expression, they looked at Li Yi suspiciously, and their eyes gradually became unfriendly. Miss Suemo. Only then did Li Yi know the woman's name. It sounded a little familiar. After thinking for a while, he finally remembered that the last time the little prince took him to the Jade Courtyard to listen to music, the woman who sang, "Immortal on the Magpie Bridge," seemed to be called Suemo or something. At that time, the little prince Li Xian praised the woman as rare in the world, but because she was wearing a veil, Li Yi didn't see her face clearly. Moreover, at that time, his mind was filled with the excitement of hearing, "Immortal on the Magpie Bridge," in this world. How could he have the time to see what she looked like? He thought that there were people in this world who had the same experience as him, but it turned out to be an empty joy. At that time, under the disappointment, he naturally wasn't in the mood to listen to music, and then left in disappointment. Now that he thought about it, he forgot to apologize to Miss Suemo. When he rushed up excitedly, he seemed to have grabbed her hand and scared her. No wonder she would think of him as a lecher. After the woman called out her name, Li Yi immediately understood the ins and outs of the matter. At this time, his heart was relieved. Lecher was a lecher, as long as he didn't sleep with the girl and didn't pay. Xiao Huan, let's go. He stretched out his hand and waved it in front of the little servant girl who didn't know what was going on, and took her hand and walked away. This matter was just a misunderstanding, and it was his fault. When the two of them met again, Li Yi could just apologize and let bygones be bygones. However, since this woman was so aggressive, he naturally would not ask for a rebuff. Whether it was Miss Zuamo or the top courtesan in the Jade Courtyard, what did it have to do with him? Anyway, the lives of the two people were destined not to have too much intersection. In this life, Li Yi only wanted to carry on the lucrative career of being the husband of the stronghold to the end. He wanted to guard the Willow Leaf Village and strive to earn enough money before the age of 20, then he could retire and start to enjoy his old age. If the days in the stronghold were boring, he could also go down the mountain to relax with Lu Rui and Xiao Huan behind his back. For example, he could go to the Jade Courtyard to listen to songs and so on. Of course, he would only ask for other people, not this Miss Zuamo's business. The title of the top courtesan did not work on him. Chapter 67. You. Seeing the scholar holding the servant girl's hand and leaving with an indifferent expression, the anger on Xing Zumo's pretty face became even stronger. However, seeing that many people had already noticed them, she still had some scruples in her heart. She snorted coldly and didn't chase after them. That night on the stage, this scholar rushed up and grabbed her hand as if he had gone crazy. She was really scared and subconsciously thought of him as a lecher. However, after thinking about it carefully, she felt that he didn't seem to want to take advantage of her. However, thinking about how he left without even saying a word of apology, she naturally felt a bit angry. For the past few days, he had been thinking about this matter and always felt uncomfortable. When he saw that scholar who didn't understand etiquette again, all the accumulated anger was vented out. She originally thought that if he seriously explained and sincerely apologized, this matter could be resolved. However, who would have thought that he would ignore her like this, let alone have the slightest intention of apologizing? I'm so angry. She caressed her chest a few times, and only then did she feel a little better. Drunken ink, what happened? Seeing her like this, the women all looked at each other. For some reason, Wan Ruoqing took a step forward and looked at her. We'll talk about this later. Sister Ruoqing, where's the osmanthus cake I asked you to bring for me? Xing Zumo shook her head and suppressed the anger in her heart. She wanted to use a happy matter to divert attention. When she was unhappy, she would eat. This had always been her habit. Wan Ruoqing's expression froze, and an awkward expression appeared on her pretty face. Seeing her expression, Xing Zumo said with a bitter expression, You can't have forgotten, right? Ahem, Zumo, you should tell us what happened just now, the older woman said with a dry cough. It's just a lecher. What's there to say? Xing Zumo glared fiercely at Li Yi's departing figure again. She gritted her teeth and deliberately emphasized the word lecher. Young master, what is a lecher? On the other side, the servant girl scratched her head curiously and looked up at Li Yi. Just now, that beautiful big sister said that the son-in-law was a lecher and seemed to be very angry, but what was a lecher? Until now, Xiao Huan had not figured it out. You're just a little girl. Don't ask. Li Yi rubbed her head and said. Little girl, home. A puzzled expression appeared on the little servant girl's face again, but this time she roughly understood Li Yi's meaning. She lowered her head and rubbed the corner of her clothes, murmuring softly, Xiao Huan is already 15 years old, not young anymore. Son-in-law. She raised her head and was about to ask something when Li Yi picked up a piece of pastry from the table and stuffed it into her mouth. Try this. She made a few muffled sounds, but the servant girl knew that the son-in-law didn't seem to be willing to answer the question just now. After swallowing the pastry, she didn't speak anymore. What exactly did the lecher mean? Once he returned to the stronghold, he would ask his mistress and find out. That's right, that beautiful big sister just now, she seemed to have seen her somewhere before. the young girl sat there with one hand propping up her chin. She glanced in that direction from afar and just happened to see the side of Xingzuo's face. After a slight pause, she seemed to remember something. Her beautiful eyes suddenly widened and her small mouth also opened in surprise. At this moment, the figure of that beautiful big sister finally overlapped with a certain figure in the little servant girl's memory. That painting scroll that the son-in-law had her lock up in the cabinet, wasn't the woman drawn on it the beautiful big sister just now? For a moment, the little servant girl seemed to have discovered something incredible, and her heart immediately stirred. Previously, she had thought that the son-in-law probably liked the woman in the painting very much, which was why he had her carefully put it away and locked it in the cabinet. There were many things that the little servant girl didn't dare to ask. She could only think in her heart, just what kind of story did the son-in-law and that beautiful woman have, but every time she thought of this, there would be a sour feeling in her heart. Fortunately, apart from that hidden painting, the son-in-law was no different from before. After a long time, her heart gradually relaxed. And after seeing the woman in the painting today, the young girl's heart finally began to panic. Although she didn't understand what that beautiful big sister said, she and the son-in-law did indeed know each other. She was so angry. Was it because the young miss had snatched the son-in-law away? The little servant girl didn't want to think in the worst direction, but because of her worry, she couldn't help but guess. What if the son-in-law abandoned Xiao Huan and left with that beautiful big sister? If the son-in-law left, the young miss and second miss would definitely be very sad, but the one who would be the most sad would still be Xiao Huan, if the son-in-law was willing to bring Xiao Huan along. If that was the case, then Xiao Huan would definitely be overjoyed. No, Xiao Huan couldn't leave. If Xiao Huan also left, there would only be the two young misses left at home, and they would be even more sad. It would be best if the son-in-law didn't leave, and everyone could still be together like before. This was the best ending that the little servant girl could think of. No one knew when the poetry meet had officially begun. It should have been long prepared, and not long after, someone had already made a few poems. Upstairs and downstairs, there were people who gathered and evaluated each other. And at this moment, Li Yi heard a bad news from the gossip. Today's competition was limited to a few poetry meets. Even if someone made a good poem, it wasn't within the scope of the competition. At most, they would only receive a few words of praise from others. In other words, those few poetry meets were the absolute protagonists of today. Li Yi and the rest of the people here were just there to express their opinions on the poems that others brought out. Of course, to Li Yi, what he cared about was not the poem or the qualification to participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet. If he didn't have the qualification to participate in the poetry written test, then even if he copied out a good poem, he would not have the chance to get the 100 silver taels. At this moment, he was a little regretful. He should have checked the almanac before going out today. It must be written that it was forbidden to go out, and it was better to stay at home. Not only did he embarrass himself in front of those girls, but it was also bad luck to run into that lady Zuemo. Now, even the last bit of comfort in his heart was gone. He had wanted to leave with Xiao Huan, but the fruits and pastries here were really quite delicious. It had taken a lot of effort to get here, and it was not worth it to just leave like this. He should eat to his heart's content first. With this in mind, when he turned his head, he saw the little servant girl resting her chin with one hand. He didn't know what she was thinking, but the expression on her pretty face changed. Sometimes it was full of worry, and sometimes there was a smile at the corner of her mouth. There was even a moment when tears appeared at the corner of her eyes. Just as Li Yi was wondering what kind of drama was playing out in the little servant girl's heart, Xingzuo's somewhat surprised voice sounded from the other side. What? My osmanthus cake was eaten by that lecher. After knowing what had just happened, Xingzuo's eyebrows rose, and anger once again appeared on her pretty face. Her gaze was like a knife as she looked in a certain direction. Li Yi sensed something and looked up. When their gazes met in the air, sparks seemed to shoot out. At the same time, they snorted coldly and turned their heads. Chapter 68. Actually, that scholar doesn't look like a lecher. I'm afraid there must be some misunderstanding. The slightly older woman from the Union Poetry Club said after a moment of silence. Zingzumo already understood that the scholar didn't do it on purpose, but his attitude of disregard just now still made her very angry. Although her impression of him as a lecher had changed, she still couldn't calm the anger in her heart. The woman named Wan Ruoqing saw the expression on Zingzumo's face and was slightly surprised. That scholar looked gentle, so how did he anger her to this extent? Thinking back to what just happened, she gradually had a guess. He came to ask for pastries from her because he thought she was a servant here. She couldn't help but look down at her clothes. Was she dressed like a servant today? Whether it was because of this or because of Zingzumo, she was more or less curious about the scholar. When she looked up in that direction, she just happened to see the scholar pick up a piece of preserved fruit. After a few breaths, he picked up a piece of pastry. After a few breaths, he drank a cup of tea and picked up another piece of preserved fruit. It seemed like he was more interested in these things than the poems made by the scholars. What a strange scholar. Seeing the scholar who was completely focused on the food in front of him, Ruoqing's cherry lips parted slightly and thought to herself. Not long after, someone else came up with a new composition, which caused a round of applause. Several women got up from their seats and walked over to the other side. Li Yi sat there and would occasionally hear a few poems made by the so-called scholars around him. What followed was a round of praise from the crowd. Li Yi couldn't help but twitch the corner of his mouth when he heard those people praising those poems as if they were masterpieces that had been passed down from generation to generation. What good poems! These so-called excellent Mid-Autumn Festival poems were just a few people looking at the moon and feeling high. When it came to Mid-Autumn Festival poems, the ones that appeared in one's mind should be raise one's head to look at the bright moon, bow one's head to think of home, raise one's cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3, may people last forever, 1,000 miles together. Compared to those poems that had been passed down for hundreds of generations, what was the one being praised now? The trace of disdainful mockery on Li Yi's lips was caught by Zingzumo, who had been staring at him from not far away. I wonder what kind of good poem he can make. He's quite arrogant. He snorted coldly. In his heart, he had already regarded Li Yi as an arrogant student with no talent at all. Ouch! Xiao Huan's surprised voice rang in Li Yi's ears. He quickly turned his head and saw the little servant girl covering her head. A young man opposite her was covering his chest, the front of his shirt was wet. Sir, I'm sorry. The servant girl hurriedly lowered her head and apologized with a panicked expression. The young man clearly didn't have a good temper and was splashed with tea. He was about to scold her when he looked up to see that the person in front of him was such a pretty girl. His expression froze for a moment before an indescribable light flashed through his eyes. It's fine. The young man smiled and reached out to help her up. At this moment, a figure blocked in front of him. The young man frowned and asked, "Who are you?" "Son-in-law." Xiao Huan was like a child who had done something wrong and stood behind Li Yi. "Son-in-law." The young man looked at Li Yi suspiciously and asked, "This lady, is this brother's servant girl?" "This servant girl is insensible and has caused trouble for brother." Li Yi cupped his hands and spoke apologetically. "It's just a small matter." The young man looked at the servant girl and a strange light appeared in his eyes. He then looked at Li Yi and asked with a smile, "Brother, you look very unfamiliar. Are you a scholar of Qing and Fu?" Li Yi noticed the way he looked at Xiao Huan. Seeing that he was clearly trying to get close to him, Li Yi furrowed his brows and casually said a few words. Just as he was about to lose his patience, the young man suddenly changed the topic. He pointed at the two girls standing behind him and said, "What do you think of my two servant girls?" Li Yi raised his head and glanced at him, not knowing what the other meant. These two girls were about 17 or 18 years old. They should be at the age of innocence, but their brows showed tiredness and their eyes were dim. They were far from Xiao Huan's liveliness. The young man smiled slightly and said, "To tell you the truth, I am quite interested in brother's servant girls. If brother is willing to part with them, I am willing to use these two servant girls in exchange." When the two girls standing behind the young man heard this, their expressions changed slightly. They raised their heads and glanced at Li Yi, and a glimmer of light appeared in their eyes. Son-in-law. Hearing this, the servant girl's face paled. She immediately grabbed the corner of Li Yi's clothes tightly, afraid that Li Yi would trade her out. "My apologies, I have no interest in brother's servant girls." Li Yi raised his head to look at her and replied indifferently. "I'm being sincere. Why do you have to keep me at arm's length, brother? To tell you the truth, my father is the Anxi district magistrate. If brother has any problems in the future, I might be able to help." Seeing that Li Yi had no intention of agreeing, the young man was not in a hurry and continued to speak with a smile. Qing and Prefecture City was under the jurisdiction of the Anxi district. Although there were many people in the prefecture city who could suppress the Anxi district magistrate, in the eyes of most people, this title was enough to intimidate them. On the surface, the young man's words sounded like a negotiation, but in reality, it was a threat. What he secretly wanted to express was, "I like this girl. You have to change her no matter what. I am the son of the county magistrate. It's up to you to decide if you want to change her or not." However, while the title of the district magistrate's son could intimidate others, it could not intimidate Li Yi. He had slept in the prince's mansion and visited a brothel with the prince's son. What was a mere district magistrate's son to him? The young man didn't try to hide his words just now. Between scholars, exchanging maids and concubines was something that had happened since ancient times. To them, it was a very normal thing. At this moment, many people had already gathered around, smiling and speaking up for the young man. "The one named Lu is not a good person. If that girl ends up in his hands, she will probably be defiled again. I wonder if that scholar, will he trade? The one named Lu's father is the district magistrate. I'm afraid that scholar." Sigh. Not far away, the women of the Union Poetry Society sighed. Their expressions were unsightly. After all, they were also women. Of course, they could not stand to see women being exchanged like goods. Wan Ruoqing also sighed. Although she was very angry about this, it was not something they could change. This guy, he probably won't trade, right? Although she hated Li Yi to the core, for some reason, Xing Zumo had an indescribable confidence in him. She is just a servant girl. If you are willing to part with her, I'm afraid it will become a good story in today's poetry meeting. At this time, a young man who seemed to be somewhat famous came up and looked at Li Yi with a smile. He said, "I am Su Wendian, the president of the Dongli Poetry Society. Brother Lu is my friend, so please give me some face." Li Yi gave him a bright smile and said, "Sell your mother." Puff! The next moment, the scene became quiet. Xing Zumo spat out the tea she had just taken. Chapter 69. Xing Zumo hurriedly wiped away the water stains on her clothes. Deep shock surged onto her pretty face. At this moment, she was somewhat suspicious. Had she heard incorrectly just now? In any case, the scholar was still a scholar. How could he say such unreasonable words? But when she turned her head, she saw that Wan Ruoqing and the other women had the same expression as her. They were clearly also shocked. Only then did she confirm that what the scholar had said just now was indeed those 4 words. Her mouth opened slightly. When she looked at the scholar standing in front of the young servant girl, her gaze changed for the first time. This young master, how can he? Wan Ruoqing's lips parted slightly. It was unknown what expression was on her pretty face. Scholars placed great importance on their manners. She had never seen a scholar say such vulgar words. She had always been disgusted by such things. But for some reason, at this moment, she couldn't feel any disgust towards the scholar. If the scholar really succumbed to the young man's despotic power, she would most likely be truly disappointed. She didn't think that not only did the scholar refuse, but the way he refused was so unique. The women who belonged to the Yuning Poetry Club beside her all had their lips curled up. They wanted to laugh but had to forcefully suppress it to avoid losing their composure. It was truly difficult. But at this moment, when they looked at the scholar again, they instantly felt he was much more pleasing to the eye. "Sell your mother." Seeing the scholar in front of him say these words with a smile on his face, the young man named Su Wentian's expression was first startled, then immediately turned red. He pointed a finger at Li Yi, his lips trembling, unable to say a word. He was a scholar, and the people he usually interacted with were the same. As a famous scholar in Qing and Fu, there were great scholars in their conversations and there were no commoners, but which great scholar would open his mouth and say, "Sell your mother"? They were all scholars with status, could they speak more civilly? Even though he was angry and wanted to curse back regardless of his status, he couldn't think of any curse words that could rival the 4 words just now. His face became even redder. It was really difficult for a scholar who had been reading the books of sages since he was young to compete with Li Yi, a veteran from the 21st century, in cursing. Vulgar man. Such filthy words. Unbearable. Unbearable. What a disgrace. You're a scholar in vain. Around Su Wendian, the scholars who belonged to the Dongli Poetry Society were also stunned for a moment, but then their faces changed greatly, and they started to criticize Li Yi with livid faces. Everyone here is a scholar. Even if you don't agree, everyone will try to persuade you. Wouldn't it be fine as long as you agree? Why do you have to scold others? In the face of these people's accusations, Li Yi's expression did not change. After all, compared to the scolding methods in the future, which often revolved around your mother, 18 generations of ancestors, as the radius, genitals as the weapon, and sexual fantasies as the skill, which radiated 360 degrees and overturned the entire family tree, curses such as disgraceful, unworthy of being a scholar, and even son of a B*tch, did not have the slightest impact on him. Li Yi had restrained himself just now because he was worried that this kind of cursing skill would be too powerful. If he really angered some of them to death here, he would inevitably be sued. At the very least, he really didn't need to be angry with these guys. On the surface, they were all geniuses and scholars, but secretly, they were thieves and prostitutes. The things they did were dirtier than the previous one. Some of the dirty things could even be put on the table to be traded, but in their eyes, it was extremely normal. Especially when the scholar named Su Wendian asked him to do him a favor with a smile, Li Yi felt that the 4 words he gave him couldn't be more suitable. It was simple and crude, but the effect was remarkable. The Dongli Poetry Club was the most popular candidate for the first place today, attracting the attention of many people. It didn't take long for the abnormality here to attract many people's attention. Many people in the surroundings looked over, and several figures also walked down from the upstairs. Su Wendian cherished his reputation after all. No matter what the result was, it wouldn't be a good thing for him. With a cold snort, he turned around and left without saying a word. Beside him, several people of the White Dew Poetry Club also glared at Li Yi with vicious eyes, showing disdain to associate with him. "I'll remember you." The young man who claimed to be the county magistrate's son glanced at Li Yi gloomily and said coldly. Behind him, two young girls' eyes flashed with a trace of sadness. They glanced at the little maid standing behind Li Yi with envy, then followed the young man and left silently. "Young master, it's all Xiao Huan's fault." After these people left one after another, the little maid pulled the corner of Li Yi's clothes and said while sobbing. There were tears at the corners of her eyes. "It's okay, it's not Xiao Huan's fault." Li Yi smiled and rubbed her head as he said softly. "But they all said that, son-in-law." The young maidservant raised her head, two teardrops rolling down from her gem-like eyes. From what she heard, the words those people used to scold son-in-law were already very unpleasant to hear. "Oh," before she could finish her words, Li Yi stuffed a piece of pastry into her mouth. Li Yi pinched the little maid's pretty face. The little girl pouted and blinked innocently at him. He wiped her tears and said with a smile, "They are all bad people, they made our Xiao Huan cry. After eating this pastry, let's go home." That scholar's words just now were so satisfying. On the other side, a 16 or 17-year-old girl covered her mouth and laughed so hard that tears were about to flow down. Thinking of the expressions of Su Wendian and the others when they just left, the women couldn't help but laugh. As women, they naturally couldn't bear to see men exchange maids and even concubines like goods. The scholar's actions won them a lot of good impressions. "Zumo, I don't think that young master is a lecher at all. Otherwise, he would have already exchanged the two girls." A woman looked at Sing Zumo and said, "Do you have some misunderstanding with him? Even if he's not a lecher, he's not a good person either." Sing Zumo pursed her lips and said disdainfully. No matter what, she couldn't forgive that guy's attitude towards her. As they were talking and laughing, a sudden cry came from upstairs. They all looked up and found that many people had gathered around a table. What happened over there? Could another masterpiece have appeared? While they were puzzled, the older woman went up the stairs. A moment later, she came down with a paper raft in her hand with a worried expression. "You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."